There is something quietly astonishing about the way this world holds together. From the outside, it looks like a place of roots and ribbons, of gyms and championships, and the steady rhythm of a young trainer setting out with a single companion at their side. It looks contained, orderly, simple enough to follow in an afternoon, and yet the more carefully you look at it, the more you begin to sense the architecture underneath, the deeper systems that have been running long before the first Pokeball was ever cast. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The world of Pokemon is not simply a backdrop, it is a functioning system with its own ecology, its own economy, its own spiritual logic, and its own long history of catastrophe and recovery. The towns and cities that trainers pass through are only the visible surface of something much older and more layered. Beneath every peaceful route is a landscape shaped by ancient forces. Beneath every cheerful gym battle is a cultural tradition rooted in centuries of negotiation between humans and creatures of extraordinary power. The world actually works. It runs on consistent principles. And when you begin to trace those principles from their origins to their present form, the whole picture becomes something genuinely breathtaking. The first thing worth understanding is that the Pokemon world did not begin with humans. It began, according to everything the games and myths suggest, in absolute silence. A silence so complete it had no shape, no dimension, no direction at all. From within that formlessness came a single egg, suspended in a space that was not yet space. And from that egg emerged something that the people of many regions would eventually come to call Arceus, a being of enormous and almost incomprehensible creative power. The mythology around this moment is careful not to be too specific. It does not say exactly where the egg came from. It does not explain why there was an egg at all. It simply begins with the hatching and lets everything else flow from there. Arceus, newly emerged into an emptiness it alone could shape, began to move. The movement itself created the first distinctions. Space became separate from time. Matter found its boundaries. Energy found its channels. The Sinnoh creation mythology, preserved in the texts of the Canalave Library and in the tablets of Mount Coronet, describes this process in the language of a slow unfolding. Dialga and Palkia were among the first beings summoned into existence, carrying within them the ongoing responsibility for time and space, respectively. They did not simply hold those forces, they were those forces embodied. Their existence was the reason the universe continued to have a past and a present and a shape at all. What follows in the mythology is something that sounds almost domestic in comparison, though the scale of it never shrinks. Arceus created the Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf. Three beings associated with knowledge, emotion, and willpower. The creation myth presents them as a kind of distribution of qualities that a single being could not fully hold and still remain coherent. Uxie carried the capacity to know. Mesprit carried the capacity to feel. Azelf carried the capacity to act with intention. Together, they completed a picture of what a conscious being would need to exist meaningfully in the world that was being made around them. They were gifts, in a way, a preparation for the lives that would eventually fill this new world. The distortion world, that strange mirror space where Giratina was banished, is often read as a place of punishment, and there is certainly a version of the myth that supports that reading. Giratina acted violently in the earliest moments and was removed from the primary world as a consequence. But there is another reading that sits just beneath the surface. The distortion world is also described as the space that makes the primary world stable, the antimatter realm, the shadow dimension whose existence allows everything else to remain coherent. Giratina did not simply lose its place in the world. It became necessary in a different way. Its exile was also its purpose. That tension between punishment and function, between removal and necessity, runs through a great deal of Pokemon mythology, and it is worth holding on to as we move forward. The earth that Arceus shaped was not immediately hospitable to human life. Before people arrived in the places we now call regions, those landscapes were already occupied by Pokemon whose natures were ancient and powerful and deeply particular. The mountains of Sinnoh were shaped by forces that had been operating for millennia before anyone built a town at their base. The seas were already crossed by currents that massive aquatic beings moved through with the ease of things that had always belonged there. The forests were already networked by invisible channels of communication between Pokemon who understood their territories in ways that went far beyond what any map could capture. The Pokemon that existed in these primordial landscapes were not simply animals, they were participants in ecosystems that had developed their own balances, their own hierarchies, their own systems of governance. The evidence for this is scattered through the lore in ways that are easy to miss if you move through it quickly. The noble Pokemon of Hisui, those ancient individuals who had developed particular concentrations of power and responsibility, suggest that within wild populations there existed beings of unusual authority. They were not rulers in a human sense. They did not give commands or hold courts, but they were centers of gravity around which the behavior of other Pokemon organized itself. Their calm meant calm. Their agitation meant disruption. Their health was the health of the landscape around them. When humans first arrived in these landscapes, or first grew numerous enough to require significant territory within them, they came into contact with systems that had not been designed with them in mind. The early relationships between humans and Pokemon were not the easy partnerships depicted in later traditions. They were negotiations conducted under conditions of genuine uncertainty. Humans were not the dominant force. In many cases, they were not even the most numerous or the most capable. They were newcomers entering into a world that had already decided on its own rules. The people of ancient Hisui understood this in a way that later generations largely lost. The settlement at Jubilife village, in which would eventually become the Jubilife city we know from later Sinnoh, existed in a state of genuine precariousness. The Pokemon that moved through the surrounding lands were not merely wild animals to be avoided or captured. They were forces to be negotiated with, appeased, and if possible, gradually understood. The Galaxy Expedition Team, which had traveled to Hisui from a distant homeland, brought with them certain technologies and assumptions that the indigenous clans did not share. The Pokeball itself, in the crude form it took in those early days, represented a particular theory about how the relationship between human and Pokemon could work, a theory based on containment and cooperation rather than on the older model of reverence and distance. The Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan, the two groups who had lived longest in the region, organized their spiritual lives around relationships with Pokemon that had more in common with the ancient Sinnoh mythology than with anything the expedition team had brought along. For the Diamond Clan, time was the fundamental dimension of existence, and the Lord of Time, whom they associated with Dialga, was the center of their cosmology. For the Pearl Clan, space was primary, and the Lord of Space, Palkia, held the corresponding position. These were not simply religious preferences, they were practical orientations toward the world. The Diamond Clan understood time as the source of abundance, of memory, of the continuity that made community possible. The Pearl Clan understood space as the source of possibility, of the distances that gave life room to vary and grow. Their disagreement about which was more fundamental was sincere and long-standing, and it shaped how each group moved through the landscape, how they built their relationships with the Pokemon around them, and how they understood the disturbances that occasionally swept through the region when the balance between these forces was disrupted. What is remarkable about the Hisui period, Seen from the perspective of understanding how the Pokemon world works, is how clearly it shows the world in a state before the dominant paradigm of trainer culture had fully formed. There were no gyms, there were no championships, there was no central authority telling young people to travel the region and build a team of six. There was instead a much more tentative, more locally negotiated set of relationships between humans and Pokemon, varying by clan, by location, and by the specific nature of the Pokemon involved. The Survey Corps that worked alongside the early settlers were doing something genuinely new. They were attempting to systematize knowledge about Pokemon that had previously been held locally, passed down through specific clans or communities who had developed it through generations of observation and careful interaction. The Pokedex, as we eventually come to know it, descends from that impulse. Professor Kukui in Alola, Professor Sycamore in Kalos, Professor Juniper in Unova, Professor Rowan in Sinnoh, Professor Birch in Hoenn, Professor Elm in Johto, Professor Oak in Kanto. These are all expressions of a much older human desire to organize what is known about Pokemon into a form that can be preserved and transmitted. The Pokedex itself is sometimes discussed as if it were simply a piece of hardware, a device that generates descriptions of species when a new Pokemon is scanned into it. But the entries in those devices represent accumulated knowledge drawn from countless observations made over many years by many different researchers. They are condensations of something vast, and they are, even at their best, incomplete. A Pokedex entry typically tells you something about a Pokemon's habitat, its behavior, its physical characteristics, and sometimes a detail about how it relates to other Pokemon or to humans. What it rarely tells you is how a particular individual within that species behaves when no researcher is observing it, what its relationships with specific members of its own group look like, or what role it plays in the larger ecological systems of its home region. These are things that require extended observation, the kind of patient watching that the earliest survey teams in Hisui practiced, but that the faster pace of modern research often cannot accommodate. The Pokedex is an extraordinary tool, but it represents the outer edge of formal human understanding, not the full depth of what there is to know. The Pokemon that trainers encounter and build relationships with are individuals within species that have histories and social structures far richer than any single entry can convey. A Growlithe that has been raised from a pup by a human trainer has a completely different relationship to the world than a Growlithe that has spent its life in a volcanic field maintaining the territorial patterns its pack has followed for generations. Both are, in the formal sense, Growlithe, but their inner lives, their learned behaviors, their understanding of what the world contains and how to move through it are as different as the environments that shaped them. The ecology of the Pokemon world operates on principles that would be broadly recognizable to anyone familiar with the natural sciences of our own world, but with modifications that reflect the extraordinary nature of what Pokemon are. The type system, which organizes Pokemon and their moves into categories like fire, water, grass, electric, and so on, is not simply a game mechanic. It reflects something real about the nature of these creatures. Fire-type Pokemon carry within them an actual relationship to combustion and heat. They do not merely mimic fire. They produce it through biological processes that are genuinely extraordinary. A Magmar, for instance, expels flames from the pores of its body at temperatures approaching 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The biological infrastructure required to produce that kind of heat without destroying the organism producing it is something that no real-world biology has achieved. The Pokemon world's version of biology accommodates this by essentially treating elemental energy as a genuine component of living systems, as real and as necessary as the chemical processes that drive ordinary life. This has consequences for ecology that go well beyond what you might initially expect. In a forest, where a substantial population of fire type Pokémon maintains territory, the fire ecology of that forest is shaped by them, not just by the occasional conflagration that might result from a battle or a display of dominance, but by the ambient heat they generate, by the way they alter the soil chemistry with flame residue, by the patterns of burn and regrowth they create over years and decades of habitation. Conversely, water type Pokemon in a mountain range influence the local hydrology in ways that go beyond what simple evaporation or rainfall could explain. The water that passes through a population of Vaporeon or Lapras or Gyarados carries something of those creatures within it. It moves differently, it nourishes differently. The entire catchment system of a mountain fed by Pokemon influenced springs behaves according to rules that combine ordinary hydrology with something more. This is why the legendary Pokemon associated with weather and natural forces matter so much to the regions they inhabit. Kyogre and Groudon, those ancient and enormous beings who are said to have shaped the ocean floors and the continental masses respectively, are not simply powerful Pokemon who happen to live in Hoenn. They are, in a meaningful sense, part of the ongoing operation of the planet. The expansion of the seas and the emergence of land masses are processes attributed to their ancient activity. Their presence in the world, even sleeping, even contained, continues to influence the weather patterns and geological activity of the regions around them. The battle that caused such catastrophe in ancient Hoenn was not simply a fight between two powerful creatures. It was a disruption of the planetary operating system. Rayquaza, the enormous sky serpent that circles in the upper atmosphere, exists precisely to prevent that disruption from becoming permanent. Its role is one of the clearest examples of what might be called ecological governance in the Pokemon world. There are forces that, left to themselves, would create conditions incompatible with the complex balanced ecosystems that most life depends on. Kyogre and Groudon are both expressions of genuine and necessary planetary forces. Water and land are both essential, but an excess either destroys the conditions required by the other. Rayquaza does not permanently eliminate either force. It does not favor one over the other. It intervenes when the imbalance becomes too great, returning both to a state where they can coexist without destroying what depends on them both. This pattern appears repeatedly in the larger structure of how the Pokemon world manages its most powerful forces. Dialga and Palkia, the embodiments of time and space, could theoretically come into conflict in ways that would be catastrophic for everything that exists within time and space. Their counterpart, Giratina, the antimatter entity banished to the distortion world, turns out to be the stabilizing force that prevents such conflicts from escalating beyond repair. The creation myths suggest that this arrangement was not accidental. Arceus, in distributing its own power among these beings, created a system of checks that would continue to function even in its own absence. The world is not maintained by constant divine intervention. It is maintained by a structure that was built to be self-regulating. This is one of the most quietly profound ideas in Pokemon mythology, and it deserves a moment of attention. The world does not need Arceus present and active to remain coherent. The forces that Arceus established, distributed among beings like Dialga and Palkia and Giratina and the Lake Trio and the Weather Trio and all the others, continue to operate according to the principles built into them. The role of mythical and legendary Pokemon in the ongoing life of the world is not primarily one of active intervention. It is primarily one of ongoing presence, of being the living embodiment of forces that need to be embodied to remain in balance. The human relationship to this system of balanced forces is a long and complicated one. Humans did not design it. They did not establish it. They arrived relatively recently in the timeline of the world into a structure that was already operating. Their earliest responses to that structure varied enormously. Some peoples, like the clans of ancient Hisui, developed traditions of respectful observation and careful negotiation. Others moved more quickly toward the idea that Pokemon were resources to be managed, tools to be used, or power to be claimed. The history of villainous organizations across the regions reads, in many ways, as a history of that second impulse taken to its extreme. Team Rocket, in its Kanto and Johto incarnations, represents the commodification impulse at its most straightforward. Giovanni understood Pokemon as assets, as sources of profit, of power, of leverage in the ordinary human world of organized crime. The cruelty in Team Rocket's operations came not from any particular ideology about Pokemon or their place in the world. It came from a simple refusal to take that question seriously at all. Pokemon were, in this worldview, things. Useful things, powerful things, but things. The question of what they experienced, what they wanted, what role they played in the larger systems of the world, did not register. Team Magma and Team Aqua, the paired antagonist organizations of Hoenn, represent something more complicated and in many ways more interesting. Both of these groups were motivated by genuine beliefs about what the world needed. Team Magma wanted to expand the landmass to create more territory for land-based life, including humans. Team Aqua wanted to expand the ocean to return the world to an earlier, more water-dominated state that they believed would better support Pokemon and the broader ecology. Both theories were wrong, catastrophically so, because both failed to understand the actual mechanism by which the world maintained its balance. They focused on the outcomes they preferred and tried to force those outcomes by awakening and redirecting forces that existed to maintain equilibrium, not to serve as instruments of human vision. The tragedy at the heart of both organizations is that their leaders genuinely believed they were acting for the good of the world. Maxie and Archie were not simply villains in the conventional sense. They were people who had looked at the world, identified what they believed to be a problem, and concluded that existing structures were too slow, too cautious, or too ignorant to solve it. They turned to legendary Pokemon as instruments because they believed those beings possessed the power necessary to make the changes they thought were needed. What they failed to understand, and what their eventual confrontation with the consequences of awakening Groudon and Kyogre made unavoidable, was that these beings were not instruments. They were forces, and forces, awakened without the understanding to guide them, do not follow the intentions of whoever awakened them. This failure of understanding is one of the most consistent themes in the history of human Pokemon conflict across the regions. It appears in Sinnoh, where Cyrus attempts to use the power of Dialga and Palkia to destroy and rebuild the universe according to his own design. It appears in Unova, where Ghetsis uses his son N as a philosophical instrument to try to separate humans and Pokemon, believing that he understands the nature of that relationship better than the relationship itself does. It appears in Kalos, where the ancient king AZ built a machine to resurrect a single beloved Floette using the life energy of countless other Pokemon, a choice made out of grief so profound it overrode every other consideration. And it appears, in a form that feels different from all the others, because of its enormous scale, in the history of Galar. The Darkest Day is one of the most significant events in the known history of the Pokemon world, and it is also one of the least fully understood. What the historical record preserves is this: an enormous entity of cosmic energy fell to the earth and began to spread a force that caused Pokemon to grow beyond all natural limits, filling with a power that made them both immense and entirely uncontrollable. The landscape of Galar became a disaster zone. The structures that humans had built, the communities they had established, the social arrangements that made ordinary life possible, All of this was immediately threatened by creatures that had become something other than what they had been. The king of Galar at the time, supported by the two legendary Pokémon that would eventually become Zacian and Zamazenta, faced this catastrophe and found a way to end it. But the cost of that effort erased the names of those heroes from history. What remained were the legendary blades, the lingering traces of the energy that had caused the crisis, and a tradition of dynamaxing that turned what had been a catastrophe into a spectacle. What the people of Galar in the contemporary era largely did not know was that the entity responsible for the darkest day had not been destroyed. It had been contained, sealed within the earth, its energy periodically channeled and diffused through the mechanism of dynamaxing to prevent it from building to catastrophic levels again. Leon and his rival, Hop, and their predecessors in the champion seat were all unknowingly participants in a system designed to manage something that had never truly been dealt with. The discovery that Eternatus still existed, still coiled beneath the energy power plant, waiting for the moment when enough energy had accumulated for it to emerge again, represents one of the most unsettling revelations in the entire history of the regions, because it means that the safety of an entire region for generations depended on a mechanism that nobody fully understood and that could have failed at any time. This pattern of managed catastrophe appears in enough places across the regions to suggest that it is not an anomaly. The legendary beasts of Johto, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune exist because of a fire, a human fire, one that consumed the brass tower in Ecritake City and killed 3 Pokémon who happened to be sheltering within it. Ho-Oh, the great rainbow bird of the north, witnessed this destruction and used its power to resurrect those 3 Pokémon in new forms, forms shaped by the circumstances of their death and resurrection. Raikou carries the lightning that fell the night of the fire, and Entei carries the fire itself. Suicune carries the rain that eventually extinguished it. They are living monuments, as much as they are living beings, to a specific act of human carelessness and to the divine mercy that answered it. They roam because they cannot settle. Their nature does not permit the stillness that would allow them to simply exist in one place. They were made in motion, and they remain in motion, carrying their memorial nature through every landscape they cross. The Tin Tower, later called the Bell Tower, was rebuilt. It stands today as a place of quiet reverence in Ecritake City, and Ho-Oh occasionally returns to its highest perch. But the burned tower, left deliberately in its ruined state as a reminder, still stands across the street from it. The two towers are a geography of memory, one representing what was destroyed and what was learned, the other representing what was rebuilt and what remained sacred. This is not incidental architecture. It is the world itself remembering, through the physical form of the city, what happened there and why it matters. Ecritake City is perhaps the most concentrated single location for understanding how Pokemon mythology and human history interact in the world. The Kimono Girls, the guardians of the city's oldest traditions, maintain a relationship to the legendary Pokemon of Johto that goes back further than written records can reach. They understand things about Ho-Oh and Lugia that the professors in their Pokedex entries do not fully capture. Not because they have studied these beings scientifically, but because their tradition of care and attention has accumulated knowledge of a different kind. The knowledge of how to be in the right relationship with something vast, how to approach it without demanding, how to remember without claiming. Lugia, the diving Pokemon that rests in the Whirl Islands, presents a fascinating counterpoint to the more celestial nature of Ho-Oh. Ho-Oh embodies the sky, the rising, the regenerative power of the sun. Lugia embodies the depths, the still water, the power that moves beneath the surface. Its psychic nature gives it an awareness that extends beyond ordinary sensory experience. and it is said to be able to control the weather, specifically the storms of the sea, with the movements of its wings. The reason it dwells in the depths rather than the heights, according to tradition, is that it has chosen to remove itself from the surface world in order to avoid causing the very destruction its power might inadvertently produce. This is a form of self restraint that the mythology treats with enormous respect, a being that recognizes what its own presence costs and chooses absence in service of the world it loves. This quality of self aware restraint appears in other legendary Pokemon as well, though often in less dramatic form. The Lake Trio of Sinnoh, those three small psychic beings who gave knowledge, emotion, and willpower to the world, do not typically involve themselves in human affairs. They observe. They occasionally intervene when the threat to the fabric of the world is significant enough to warrant it, but their primary mode of existing in the world is quiet attention, not active management. This too is a form of care, one that trusts the systems that are in place to function as they were designed to function and reserves direct action for the moments when those systems genuinely cannot manage what they face. The guardian deities of Alolas represent a different expression of the same underlying principle. Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini are the presiding spirits of their respective islands, and their relationship with the people and Pokemon of Alola is one of the most elaborated examples in the entire series of what a functional human Pokemon spiritual relationship looks like. The Tapu are neither distant nor inactive. They make themselves felt in the daily life of Alola in ways that are specific and particular. Tapu Koko, the guardian of Melamale Island, is associated with electricity and with a certain quality of challenging energy. It tests those who live under its protection, not cruelly, but with the expectation that challenge is how strength develops. The ruins of conflict that mark its territory are not simply ceremonial sites. They are places where the ongoing negotiation between the Tapu's power and human presence has been conducted, generation after generation.
The Alolan tradition of the Island Challenge, in which young people travel the islands and face the trials set by the kahunas, is directly connected to this relationship with the Tapu. The challenge is not primarily about becoming a strong trainer, though that is certainly one of its outcomes. It is about earning the right relationship, about proving that you can move through the landscape with enough skill and enough respect to be trusted with what it contains. The grand trials, in which young challengers face the kahunas themselves, are the formal moment when that earned relationship is recognized and sealed. The Tapu's presence at these trials, their occasional direct participation in them, makes them something more than athletic competitions. They are a kind of ritual confirmation that the human and Pokemon communities of the islands continue to exist in the kind of reciprocal relationship that the world requires. The concept of the Z moves that Alola introduced into the understanding of what battle can be is inseparable from this relational context. Z moves are not simply powerful attacks. They are expressions of a bond between trainer and Pokemon that has developed to the point where it can draw on something larger than either of them alone. The Z-Ring, the bracelet that channeled this power, was originally a tapunium, a crystal connected to the Tapu themselves. The energy that Z-moves draw on comes ultimately from the Tapu and from what they represent. From the sacred relationship between the island's guardians and the life they protect. When a trainer and their Pokemon perform a Z-move together, they are briefly participating in that larger system of sacred energy. The synchronized pose, the gesture that mirrors the trainers to the Pokemon's movement, is not theatrical. It is a form of synchronization, a physical demonstration that trainer and Pokemon are genuinely acting as one, and that their unity is real enough to unlock something that neither could access alone.
This connects to a broader truth about what battles actually are in the Pokemon world. From the outside, a battle looks like competition. Two Pokemon attacking each other, each trying to reduce the other's ability to continue fighting until one can no longer stand. And in its most hollow forms, this is exactly what it is, a transaction of force with nothing deeper animating it. But in its fuller expression, as the trainers who take it most seriously understand it, a battle is a conversation. a form of direct communication between two beings and their partners that cuts through language and through the ordinary social surfaces that cover most human interaction. When a trainer's Pokemon fights with genuine commitment, when it pushes beyond what seemed like its limit, because the bond between them creates something extra that is not a mechanical output, that is a relationship made visible. The question of what Pokemon experience is one that the games approach with a notable kind of seriousness. Pokemon have emotions. This is established directly and explicitly enough to count as simple fact within the world. They can be happy or sad, energized or exhausted, comfortable or distressed. They form attachments. They remember, they grieve. The Marowak that haunts Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town is grieving. Its grief is so intense and so lasting that it has persisted into a state of being that ordinary death would not normally permit. The Cubone who wears the skull of its deceased mother is carrying sorrow in a literal, physical way that the Pokedex entries describe with a directness that is striking for what is nominally a children's medium. These are not peripheral details. They are statements about the nature of what Pokemon are and what their lives contain. Eevee's extraordinary capacity for evolution, the fact that it can develop in fundamentally different directions depending on the conditions of its environment and its own interior states, says something important about the nature of Pokemon development more broadly. Evolution in the Pokemon world is not simply biological maturation. It is a transformation that reflects the whole history of a being's experience. A Pokemon that has been through hard battles, that has developed the deep trust of a strong trainer relationship, that has been exposed to particular environments or particular kinds of energy, changes in ways that carry all of that history within them. A Vaporeon that evolved in the presence of a Waterstone did not simply change shape. It became something new because of something that happened to it, and what happened to it left a permanent mark on what it is. This is why the friendship mechanic, first introduced in the Johto games and deepened in every generation since, is not simply an additional requirement for certain evolutions. It is a statement about the world's own understanding of what relationships are for. Certain Pokemon can only reach their fullest form through a genuine and sustained relationship with a trainer who cares about them. The transformation requires the relationship. The new form is not available to a Pokemon that has been treated as a tool or managed without care. Only the Pokemon that has been genuinely known by its trainer, that has been attended to as an individual with particular needs and particular strengths, can make the change that becomes Togekiss, or Espeon, or Sylveon, or any of the others for whom high friendship is the necessary condition. The nature of friendship in the Pokemon world is something worth tracing carefully because it is both simpler and more interesting than it first appears. Friendship, as the games measure it, is essentially a record of shared experience. A Pokemon's friendship level rises when it is carried in battle, when it is healed after being hurt, when it is fed things it enjoys, when it is given the resources it needs to grow. It falls when it is allowed to faint in battle without being healed promptly, or when it is traded away to strangers without ceremony. What these mechanics are tracking, underneath the numbers, is the quality of attention. The question being asked over and over is whether this trainer is actually present with their Pokemon, whether they are noticing what their Pokemon needs and providing it, whether the relationship is one of genuine mutual care, or whether the Pokemon is simply being used. This connects directly to the Pokemon Amy system and its successors, those interfaces that allow trainers to interact with their Pokemon outside of battle. The Pokemon remember these interactions. Their performance in battle improves when their attachment to their trainer is high. They will occasionally survive attacks that should have knocked them out, because the attachment itself provides something extra. The game frames this as the Pokemon refusing to let its trainer down, which is a way of saying that the relationship creates a form of motivation that exists beyond ordinary biological capacity. The bond between a trainer and a Pokemon who deeply trust each other is a real force in the world, not metaphorical, actual. The Pokemon world's understanding of emotional bonds as having real world effects extends into some of its most ancient mythology. The jewel of life that Arceus is associated with in the mythology surrounding the Makina Temple region was given, according to the legend, to a human named Damos, who used it to restore the barren landscape around his town. When the time came to return it, Deimos betrayed Arceus and kept the jewel, leading to an act of divine retribution that transformed Arceus's view of humans for centuries afterward. The eventual resolution of this betrayal, reaching across time through the involvement of a later trainer, rests entirely on the idea that what Arceus experienced in that moment of betrayal genuinely mattered, that the emotional wound of a divine being, the discovery that trust had been misplaced, could alter the course of history for generations. This is not a story about a powerful being temporarily inconvenienced. It is a story about what it means to break a relationship that was freely and genuinely offered. The Soothe Bell, that gentle item that helps certain Pokemon warm more quickly to their trainers, is a small piece of the same logic. Its resonance creates something like an environment of calm receptivity. It signals, through the sound it makes, that the space between trainer and Pokemon is a safe one, that the trainer carrying it is someone whose presence is associated with good experiences rather than with fear or pain. These small calibrations of trust, accumulated through the entire history of the human Pokemon relationship, are what the world runs on at its most fundamental level. Not the battles, not the leagues, not the legendary powers, or the divine creation events. The daily, patient, quiet accumulation of trust between individuals. This is worth carrying in mind as we turn toward the economies and social structures of the modern Pokemon world. The Pokemon League system is the most visible institutional structure in the regions. Every major region has one. They vary in their details. Kanto organizes its gym badges by type specialization. Johto maintains a similar system while also preserving the older traditions of Ecruteak and the sacred architecture of the burned tower. Hoenn builds its system in a landscape that reflects the region's relationships with the opposing forces of land and sea. Sinnoh's gyms are distributed across a terrain shaped by the mythological geography of its creation stories, and so on through Unova, Kalos, Alola, Galar, and Paldea. Each regional system expresses something particular about the cultural values and ecological realities of the place it inhabits. But the League is not the only institutional structure, and in some ways, it is not the most significant one for understanding how the world actually functions day to day. The Pokemon Center system, with its global network of healing stations staffed by Nurse Joy and her associates, represents something quite remarkable when you stop to think about it. The centers appear in every town, even the smallest. They provide their services without charge. They are available at any hour. The staff who operate them appear to maintain consistent quality and consistent demeanor across an extraordinary range of regional contexts. The presence of the same family of healer, Nurse Joy, across so many different regions is explained within the world as a large extended family with a hereditary dedication to the healing professions. But it also functions, at a structural level, as a statement about what the world considers non-negotiable, whatever else may vary, whatever other resources may be scarce or unevenly distributed. The ability of Pokemon to receive healing is treated as a universal right. The Officer Jenny Network operates on similar principles. Law enforcement across the regions shares a family name and apparently a shared institutional training and culture, even though the specific laws and customs they enforce vary considerably from place to place. What this implies about the world's governance structure is interesting. There appears to be enough coordination between regions to support shared professional cultures and shared service networks, but not so much centralization that regional diversity has been eliminated. The world of Pokemon is not a single unified state. It is a collection of regional polities with their own championships, their own legends, their own relationships with the Pokemon that inhabit them, connected by trade routes and shared institutions that provide a kind of minimum common infrastructure without imposing uniform governance. The economy of the Pokemon world, at first glance, appears simple almost to the point of being unrealistic. Currency circulates in the form of Pokédollars. Goods and services are purchased at consistent prices across enormous distances. The Pokemart chain maintains pricing standards that would require either extraordinary logistical coordination or some kind of regulatory framework to sustain. The items available at any given Pokemart reflect the economic development level of the town it serves, with smaller or more remote communities offering a narrower range of goods than the larger urban centers. This gradation feels real. It feels like the trace of an actual economic geography, even if its mechanisms are rarely spelled out. What the Pokemon world's economy seems to revolve around, at its core, is the movement of trainers. The prize money paid out by gym leaders and other trainers in battle represents a significant income stream for successful competitive trainers, one that can sustain travel, accommodation, and equipment over the course of a full regional journey. The professors, who provide the Pokedex and the starter Pokemon, are supported by grants and institutional backing that is implied but rarely detailed. The Battle Frontier and other high level competitive facilities represent a professional ecosystem around competitive Pokemon battling that presumably generates substantial economic activity through ticket sales, broadcasting rights, and the associated industries of training, breeding, and equipment manufacturing. The breeding economy, in particular, is one of the more quietly fascinating aspects of the world's economic life. The daycares and Pokemon nurseries that operate across the regions provide a service that ranges from simple temporary boarding to the more specialized business of facilitating the production of Pokemon eggs. The knowledge required to understand the compatibility between different species, to predict the nature of the Pokemon that will hatch from a given combination, to optimize the conditions for producing particular kinds of offspring, represents a sophisticated body of expertise. The breeders who have developed this expertise occupy an interesting position in the social structure of the world. They are not trainers in the traditional competitive sense. They are artisans of a particular kind, practitioners of a craft that requires patience, observation, and a kind of intimate knowledge of Pokemon that competition-focused training does not typically develop. The contest system, developed most fully in Hoenn but present in various forms across many regions, represents an alternative conception of what a skilled human Pokemon relationship looks like. Where the gym battle system values power, strategy, and the ability to win under pressure, the contest system values beauty, grace, cleverness, toughness, and cuteness, those qualities that the judges and audience of a contest are specifically trained to appreciate. A Pokemon that excels in contests is not necessarily a powerful battler. It may have developed qualities of movement, of presence, of expressive range that simply do not register in battle, but that are unmistakable in a performance context. The trainers who develop these qualities in their Pokemon are developing a kind of attentiveness that goes beyond the tactical calculations of competitive battling. They are learning to see their Pokemon as performers, as beings with aesthetic dimension, as creatures whose inner life can be expressed and shared with an audience. The contests are, in this sense, one of the most humanizing institutions in the world. They insist that there is more than one way for a Pokemon to be excellent, that a Jigglypuff who can move an audience to tears with its song is doing something genuinely extraordinary, even if it would never last a round against a fully trained competitive battler. That a beautifully whose wings catch the light in a way that makes a crowd gasp is contributing something real to the culture of the region, something that goes beyond what any battle record could capture. The relationship between Pokemon and human culture extends into almost every domain of creative and intellectual life. The music of the regions is saturated with Pokemon influence. The cries and songs of particular Pokemon have become foundational elements of regional musical traditions. Jigglypuff's lullaby is probably the most famous example, that haunting melody that puts its listeners to sleep, which has worked its way into children's music, into festival traditions, into the kind of deeply embedded cultural memory that you never consciously learn but somehow always know. Meloetta, the melodic Pokemon, carries within its biology an entire theory of music. Its two forms, aria form and pirouette form, correspond to the relationship between song and dance, between the voice and the body in motion. The relic song that changes Meloetta's form is a piece of music so old that its origins are lost, but its power remains intact. The fact that this Pokemon's very nature is musical, that its form is literally altered by song, is one of the most elegant statements in all of Pokemon mythology about the power of music to transform. Pokemon have also influenced architecture in ways that go far beyond the obvious examples of Pokemon themed buildings. The design of Castelia City in Unova, with its towers that seem to aspire toward the height of the sky, reflects the cultural influence of the dragon Pokemon and their association with elevation and power. The network of underground passages in Sinnoh, carved out over centuries and lined with fossil art and underground markets, could not have developed without the digging Pokemon who made such construction possible. The sea routes of Hoenn are organized around the natural migratory patterns of water-type Pokemon in ways that the sailors who travel them may not consciously recognize, but which represent generations of accumulated practical knowledge about how to move through a landscape defined by creatures who have been moving through it far longer than any human navigator. The fossil system of the Pokemon world is one of its most philosophically rich elements, and it is easy to pass over it too quickly. The ability to restore ancient Pokemon from preserved genetic material, from fossils and old amber and ancient stones, means that the Pokemon world maintains a living relationship with its own evolutionary history in a way that our world cannot. The Aerodactyl that a trainer obtains from old amber is genuinely Aerodactyl, not a copy, not a simulation, a living individual of a species that last breathed tens of millions of years ago, now blinking in the daylight of the modern world. The questions this raises about identity and continuity are not addressed directly in the games, but they are present in the background of every fossil restoration. What world did that Aerodactyl's instincts prepare it for? What predators was it shaped to evade? What prey was it shaped to catch? What environment was its biology designed to navigate? None of those things exist anymore. The world that made Aerodactyl is gone, and yet Aerodactyl itself persists, because the information encoded in its fossil was complete enough to reconstruct not just its body, but its entire biological inheritance. The fact that restored fossil Pokemon can be trained, that they can form genuine bonds with trainers, that they can compete and perform and develop the kind of individual personalities that any Pokemon can develop, suggests that whatever it is that makes a Pokemon is not reducible to its ecological context. It is something more portable than that, something that persists even when everything else that surrounded it has changed beyond recognition. The Hisui region gives us the other side of this picture. The Pokemon that evolved under the particular conditions of that ancient landscape developed forms that are different in significant ways from the forms taken by members of the same species in other regions. Hisuian Growlithe, with its thicker coat and its rock-type addition, reflects the volcanic and high-altitude environment of its island home. Hisuian Arcanine carries that adaptation into a larger, more impressive form that feels genuinely ancient, genuinely suited to a world that is colder and harder and less mediated by human infrastructure than the landscapes of modern regions. These regional forms are not mutations or deformities, they are the world's way of showing its own diversity, of demonstrating that the same basic template can develop in fundamentally different directions under different pressures. The Alalan forms take this principle to its most vivid expression. The executor of Alola, tall and swaying and possessed of a casual confidence that feels almost tropical in character, became something genuinely different from its Cantonian relative because of the particular intensity of the sunlight and the particular abundance of the environment it inhabited. The Alalan Raichu, lighter and more aerial than its counterpart, reflects an island culture where speed and adaptability matter more than the kind of grinding durability that survives a harsher climate. The Alalan Marowak, with its fire and its ghost typing, with those burning bone clubs and that deep blue flame, carries something of the cultural spirit of the Alalan Islands themselves. In a place where the relationship between the living and the ancestral dead is taken seriously, where the Tapu make their presence known in daily life, it makes sense that even a Pokemon defined by grief would eventually develop a relationship with fire that transforms grief into something that can protect and heal. The Galarian forms express something similar, but in a different key. The Galarian Ponyta and Rapidash, those pastel colored creatures with their psychic nature, feel like expressions of the fairy tale side of the Galarian imagination. The Galarian Corsola, bleached and spectral, wearing its own death, is one of the most direct statements any Pokemon has made about environmental damage and its consequences. The reef that those Corsola once inhabited was destroyed, and the form they took in response carries that loss permanently in their appearance. They are not simply ghosts, they are the ghost of an ecosystem, the ghost of what a relationship between a species and its environment looks like when that environment is taken away. The Paldean region, with its open landscapes and its emphasis on multiple simultaneous paths rather than a single linear journey, expresses something important about the direction the world's understanding of what Pokemon training means has been moving.
The fact that a trainer in Paldea can choose in any order to pursue the Gymkhana Challenge, the path of legends connected to the Herba Mystica, and the story of Team Star reflects a maturing understanding that the point of the trainer's journey is not the badge or the trophy or the rank. The point is growth. The development of the individual through a widening series of encounters with challenges that require genuine engagement. A trainer who completes all three paths has not simply accumulated three sets of achievements. They have developed three distinct dimensions of relationship with the Pokemon world. They have learned to compete with rigor, to respect the deep ecology of wild Pokemon and the ancient herbs that sustain them, and to understand that sometimes the people you expect to oppose you are working through something that deserves your attention rather than your judgment. Arven's storyline in Paldea is, in this context, one of the most moving explorations of the human-Pokemon relationship in the entire series. His Mabostiff, the Pokemon he has raised and loved from a pup, is dying from an injury sustained in a confrontation with one of the Pokemon associated with the Herba Mystica. The journey to collect those herbs is, on its surface, an ecological adventure. Underneath, it is a story about what it means to refuse to give up on a Pokemon you love. About the lengths a person will go to when the relationship they are trying to preserve matters more to them than anything else. The eventual recovery of Mabostiff, and the shift in Arven's relationship to both his Pokemon and to the parent who had seemingly abandoned him, is built on the same foundation that all of the deepest human Pokemon moments in the series are built on. The conviction that these bonds are real, that they matter, that the love a human feels for their Pokemon is not embarrassing or naive. It is one of the most genuine things a person can experience. The relationship between legendary and mythical Pokemon, and the events they are connected to, has a pattern that becomes clearer the more regions you examine. Legendary Pokemon tend to be embedded in the ongoing operation of the natural world. They are the forces that keep the seasons turning, the weather behaving, the land and sea in their proper proportions. Their power is enormous, but its primary purpose is not aggressive. It is structural. They hold things in place. They maintain the conditions under which other life is possible. When they appear in the foreground of a story, it is almost always because something has gone wrong with the structures they normally maintain from the background. The weather trio of Hoenn does not typically announce itself, it operates. It is only when human ambition disrupts the balance that it has to act visibly to restore it. Mythical Pokemon tend to operate differently. They are rarer, they are more individual. Their connection to the world is less structural and more occasional, more focused on particular moments or particular relationships rather than on ongoing natural operations. Celebi, the time-traveling onion fairy, appears at moments of ecological significance. Its presence in the Ilex forest is associated with the health of the forest itself, with the kind of deep temporal stability that a living forest represents. Jirachi, the wish-granting comet Pokémon, emerges once every 1,000 years for a brief window. Its appearance is not a structural operation, it is an event. A moment in which something extraordinary becomes available to whoever happens to be present with the right kind of intention. Mew, the original genetic template, is perhaps the most interesting of the mythicals from an ecological perspective. The theory that Mew carries within its DNA the genes of every Pokémon species is not simply a curiosity. If true, it means that Mew is not just another Pokémon, however ancient and powerful. It is in some sense the ground of Pokémon biological diversity itself. The reason there are so many different kinds of Pokémon, with such different forms and capacities and natures, might ultimately trace back to a single genetic foundation that has diversified across unimaginable stretches of time into the extraordinary range of life that the world now contains. The Pokerus, that mysterious virus-like phenomenon that occasionally spreads through a trainer's team, is one of the most quietly fascinating elements of Pokémon biology. Its effects are beneficial rather than harmful. A Pokémon that has been infected with Pokerus develops its abilities more quickly, training more efficiently, and growing stronger faster than it otherwise would. The mechanism by which this works is not fully understood within the world, which is itself noteworthy. In a world where professors have cataloged hundreds of Pokémon species with at least some entry-level detail, something as significant as a widespread beneficial pathogen that enhances development remains poorly understood. The Pokédex notes it, with something approaching wonder. Professor Elm, who first documented it systematically in Johto, could confirm what it did without being able to explain the mechanism. What Pokerus might suggest, if you follow the implications carefully, is that the ecology of the Pokemon world includes mechanisms for the distribution of beneficial adaptations that operate outside the normal channels of evolution and training. Something in the biological environment of the world is, under certain circumstances, capable of enhancing the development of Pokemon it comes into contact with. This is not a hostile intrusion into the biological systems of the Pokemon it infects. It is a cooperative one. Its effects persist in a residual form even after the active infection has cleared. The Pokemon remains enhanced. What was temporarily given becomes permanently integrated. This is consistent with a broader pattern visible throughout Pokemon biology, which is that the world's living systems tend toward enhancement and cooperation more strongly than they tend toward competition and harm. There is competition, there are predator-prey relationships, there are territorial disputes and battles that cause real injury. But the overall trajectory of how Pokemon develop, how they relate to the humans who care for them, and how the various forces of the world interact, tilts toward flourishing rather than toward destruction. The catastrophes in the mythology are real and devastating. But they are disruptions of a baseline that tends toward life and growth. They are not the world's natural state. They are what happens when the systems designed to maintain balance are overwhelmed. The relationship between Pokemon and the spiritual dimension of the world is one of the areas where the games have always been most willing to reach beyond what can be explained. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower, that solemn place where Pokemon are laid to rest, raises questions about what exactly happens to a Pokemon when it dies. The existence of ghost-type Pokemon, many of whom are explicitly the spirits of deceased individuals, establishes that death in the Pokemon world is not the complete ending that it is understood to be in most real-world spiritual traditions. Something persists, something that retains the essential nature of the being it was. The Marowak that haunts the tower does not just exist as a generic spiritual presence, it maintains its specific grief, its specific identity, its specific relationship to the child it left behind. The spiritual persistence in that case is so strongly motivated by a continuing attachment, a continuing love, that it cannot simply disperse into the background of the world.
Spiritomb, assembled from 108 malevolent spirits, is a reminder that not all of what persists after death is benign. The odd keystone that contains Spiritomb is a kind of vessel for the accumulated resentment and unresolved conflict of a large number of beings who, for whatever reason, did not or could not move on. The tradition of driving away evil spirits, present in the mythology of several regions, recognizes that the spiritual dimension of the world is as complex and as varied as its material dimension. There are spirits of sorrow, like the Marowak. There are spirits of mischief, like some of the ghost types who seem to enjoy unnerving travelers. There are spirits of malice, like Spirit Omb, and there are spirits of something more neutral, something closer to the ordinary presence of a personality that has not yet found its way to wherever it is going. The Pokemon Tower was eventually converted into a broadcasting tower, a change that some readings of the lore treat as troublingly prosaic. Replacing a space of spiritual significance with telecommunications infrastructure feels like a concession to modernity that erases something irreplaceable. But there is another reading available: the choice to memorialize the departed Pokemon through a tower that broadcasts their stories, in a sense, that carries their presence into the airwaves of the region, can be understood as a continuation of the memorial impulse rather than its replacement. The Pokemon remembered in that tower are still present in Lavender Town, just in a different form. The region of Unova presents some of the most complex philosophical content in the entire Pokemon series, organized around the ideas that N and Ghetsis represent. N's position that humans and Pokemon should be separated for the sake of Pokemon, that the relationships between them are inherently exploitative because humans benefit from them at Pokemon's expense, is a position that the games take seriously enough to give it genuine philosophical articulation. N is not simply wrong. He has experienced genuine harm. He was raised in a controlled environment that was designed to prevent him from understanding the full range of human Pokemon relationships, so that his conclusions about those relationships would always be negative. He was manipulated into believing that all Pokemon suffer under human partnership because the only Pokemon he ever met as a child were those who had been actively mistreated. What the protagonist's journey through Nova is designed to show him, encounter by encounter, is that the relationships he has been taught to see as inherently exploitative are, in their better expressions, something genuinely different from exploitation. The Pokemon that travel with a caring trainer are not suffering. They are partners. They have chosen, in the way that any voluntary relationship involves choice, to be present in this collaboration. The ability to release a Pokemon, the fact that the game always makes it possible to let your Pokemon go free, is meaningful. A forced relationship would not include that option. The fact that most Pokemon, when returned to freedom, choose to stay is significant. They know what they have, and they have decided it is worth having. The final battle between the protagonist and N in the throne room of Unova's ancient castle is framed as a contest between two different theories of what Pokemon are. N's theory is that they are beings whose authentic existence is incompatible with human partnership. The protagonist's theory, demonstrated through the quality of the relationship they have built with their team across the journey, is that authentic existence for many Pokemon includes the possibility of genuine partnership with a human who cares about them. The fact that N's Pokemon, when the battle is over and the immediate crisis is resolved, choose to leave him and return to the wild, is not presented as a rejection of him. It is presented as N finally allowing his Pokemon to make the choice that he had always told them should be theirs. He has been arguing for Pokemon freedom while simultaneously holding his own partners in a kind of anxious, overprotective custody. When he releases them, they go, not because they never loved him, but because they have outgrown what he could offer them. Reshiram and Zekrom, the legendary Pokemon of truth and ideals, frame this conflict at the cosmic level. To truth and ideals are not opposites in the mythology. They are complements. The world needs both. It needs the grounded reality of what actually is, and it needs the reach toward what could be. A world that has only truth, that accepts only what is already the case, calcifies. A world that has only ideals, that reaches only toward what is not yet real, loses its footing. The protagonist's Pokemon, and by extension, the protagonist's theory of human Pokemon relationship, represents the integration of both. It is grounded in the truth of what these relationships actually are when they are good, and it is oriented toward the ideal of what they can continue to become. The idea that Pokemon and humans grow together, that the journey changes both of them, is one that deepens with each generation of games. The Pokemon Amy and Pokemon Refresh mechanics, the camp system in the wild area of Galar, the picnics of Paldea, the Let's Go Walking feature, the curry recipes, and the shared meals, all of these are mechanisms for expressing that the relationship between a trainer and their Pokemon is not primarily competitive. It is primarily relational. The battles are how the relationship is tested and how its depth is demonstrated. But the relationship itself is built in the quieter moments, in the shared meals, in the care given after a hard fight, in the attention paid to what a specific Pokemon enjoys and what it finds distressing, in the growing ability to read your partner without language, to know what they need before they have a way to express it. This is why the Pokemon that have been with a trainer the longest often perform best, not simply because they have accumulated experience points, but because the relationship has had time to develop the kind of depth that creates something real. A Charizard that has been with its trainer since it was a Charmander received in Pallet Town knows something about what its trainer is going to do in a battle before the trainer has made the decision. The communication that happens between them is fast and legible in a way that requires years to develop. It is not telepathy, it is attentiveness. It is the result of two beings who have paid close attention to each other for a very long time. The games rarely dwell explicitly on this because they are games, and the mechanics they use to represent these relationships are necessarily simplified. But the logic is present, consistently, underneath the systems. The world of Pokemon rewards care. It rewards attention. It rewards the kind of patient, sustained investment in relationship that makes partnership possible, and it does this not as a moral lesson delivered from outside, but as a simple description of how this particular world works. The traditions of the various regions around the Pokemon they consider sacred tell us something important about how culture organizes itself in a world that contains beings of such extraordinary power. The Saffron City Sylph Company, the Goldenrod City Radio Tower, the Devon Corporation in Rustboro, Sylph's successor technologies in later games, all of these represent the entrepreneurial side of the human relationship to Pokemon, the translation of the capacities of Pokemon into useful technology. The Master Ball, Sylph's most famous product, is the end result of years of research into the mechanism by which a Pokeball convinces a Pokemon to enter it. The fact that Pokemon do enter Pokeballs, that the mechanism works, that wild Pokemon of enormous power can be brought into partnership through this process is one of the most philosophically loaded facts about the world. What exactly happens inside a Pokeball remains officially unclear. The theories range from miniaturization to conversion to a kind of comfortable stasis. What is clear is that the Pokemon inside is not harmed. What is clear is that the relationship between a Pokemon and a trainer who uses their Pokeball with care and affection is a genuinely good one. The technology enables the relationship, but it is not the source of the relationship's value. The Safari Zone, preserved across multiple regions as a protected area where wild Pokemon live, without the threat of capture in battle, represents a recognition that not all Pokemon are meant to be partners. Some Pokemon thrive under the care of a trainer. They grow faster, reach heights they could not reach alone, form relationships that give their existence a richness it would not otherwise have. Others are better served by wide open spaces, by the company of their own kind, by the rhythms of wildlife uncomplicated by human expectation. The safari zone and the later national park and nature reserves that serve similar functions in other regions are statements of institutional humility, acknowledgments that the trainer culture, for all its strengths, should not be the only way of existing in the world for Pokemon or for humans. The warden who manages the Fuchsia City Safari Zone, that famously distressed figure who has lost his teeth and his gold teeth and his various other possessions in a series of mishaps across multiple game versions, is, despite his comedy, a serious institutional figure. He has dedicated his life to maintaining a space where wild Pokemon can live on their own terms. The humor around him is gentle. The institution he represents is not. The Safari Zone is one of the few places in the Pokemon world where the logic of the trainer journey does not fully apply. You are a guest there, not a challenger, not a collector building a team, a visitor to a space that belongs primarily to its residents. The relationship between the regions has always been somewhat ambiguous. The games establish that trainers regularly travel between regions, that items, Pokemon, and cultural practices move between Kanto and Johto, that Hoenn and Sinnoh have historical connections, that Unova was settled from a distant location possibly connected to the inspiration of real-world New York. But the political and economic relationships between these regions are rarely spelled out. What we can infer from the structure of the world is that there is significant trade and cultural exchange, that the healing and law enforcement networks represent shared institutions, and that the Pokemon League championship of one region is recognized and respected by other regions. Beyond that, the governance structures remain deliberately vague. This vagueness is, arguably, a creative strength. It allows each region to feel genuinely distinct, to have its own identity and its own way of organizing the human-Pokemon relationship, without requiring the elaborate diplomatic and economic backstory that a more realistic treatment would demand. The world of Pokemon is not trying to be a fully detailed geopolitical simulation. It is trying to create the feeling of a real world, rich enough to sustain exploration and deep enough to reward attention without overwhelming the foreground stories it wants to tell. The regions are, in this sense, more like emotional territories than political ones. Each one embodies a particular vision of what the world is and what it is for. Kanto is the origin, the foundational experience, the world as it was first understood. Johto is the deepening of that experience, the encounter with the older and more sacred dimensions of the same landscape. Hoenn is the expansion, the encounter with scale and with the forces that dwarf human ambition. Sinnoh is the philosophical reach, the attempt to understand the metaphysical foundations of everything. Unova is the political and ethical complexity, the examination of what the trainer tradition actually costs and what it actually gives. Kalos is the aesthetic and historical weight, the encounter with what a civilization that has been doing this for 3,000 years looks like. Alola is the communal and spiritual dimension, the vision of what it looks like when the human-Pokemon relationship is organized around shared care rather than individual achievement. Galar is the spectacle and the shadow, the examination of what happens when tradition becomes performance and when the meaning behind an institution is gradually lost. And Paldea is the integration, the attempt to hold all of these things together in a landscape that explicitly refuses to put them in order. There is a long conversation that the regions read in sequence are having with each other. Each one responds to the ones before it. Each one raises questions so that the next one will address. The introduction of the box system, which allows trainers to store Pokemon they are not currently traveling with, acknowledges a problem that the original concept of the trainer's journey created. You can only carry 6 Pokemon with you. The others exist in storage, accessible through a network that Professor Lynette designed in Hoenn that connects to Professor Oak's original system and that has been refined and expanded ever since. What happens to the Pokemon who wait? The games rarely address this directly, but the Pokemon storage systems are consistently designed to feel comfortable rather than institutional. The Pokemon resting in boxes are not in stasis, they are waiting, and the games gently suggest that they are waiting in conditions of reasonable comfort and safety.
The Pokemon home system, in the contemporary context, represents the ultimate expression of this storage architecture, a universal repository that spans regions and generations. A place where Pokemon from any game in the series can be held in connection with their trainer, regardless of what hardware they currently occupy. This has an interesting implication for what we understand about the nature of the bond between trainer and Pokemon. The bond persists across versions, across hardware generations, across the years between when a Pokemon was first caught and when its trainer returns to interact with it again. The affection that a Pokemon has built up with a trainer does not simply disappear when the cartridge is put away for a few years. Something of it persists, because the relationship was real enough to persist. This might be the deepest truth the Pokemon world has to offer about the nature of the relationships within it. Real relationships persist. They are not destroyed by distance or by time. They can be diminished, certainly. They can be damaged. They can be allowed to fade through neglect. But a relationship that was genuinely built, that was the product of real attention and real care, carries forward something of itself even through long periods of separation. The Pokemon that greets a trainer who has been away for a long time is not meeting a stranger. It is resuming something that was real and that at some level was never fully interrupted. This is the logic that makes the entire enterprise of Pokemon training meaningful, not the badges, not the championships, not the legendary encounters or the rare shinies or the perfect individual values. Those are the structures within which the meaningful thing happens. The meaningful thing is the relationship. The specific, particular, individual relationship between one trainer and one Pokemon, developed over a specific journey through a specific world. A relationship that changes both of them, that makes the trainer more capable of attention and care. That makes the Pokemon more capable of growth and expression. That constitutes, in the end, something that neither of them could have become alone. This is also, in the end, what the world is built to produce.
Not champions, not Pokedex completers, not the definitive resolution of every legendary mystery or the final accounting of every ancient catastrophe. The world is built by the logic that runs through every level of it to produce relationships, to create the conditions under which beings of very different kinds can find each other across the gap of their differences and build something genuine together. Though ancient creators understood this, if the mythology is right, Arceus distributed its own power not to create a world of pure force, but to create a world of balance, a world where different forces could coexist without annihilating each other, a world where the beings who inhabited it would have to learn to negotiate, to cooperate, to develop the kind of attention to each other that makes genuine partnership possible. The balance is not simply physical, it is relational. It is the ongoing achievement of beings who have decided moment by moment to remain in the world together. The trainers who walk the routes of their regions, who build their teams slowly and carefully, who learn to read the particular language of each Pokemon they travel with, are participating in the oldest and most fundamental project of the world they live in. They are practicing the art of relationship. They are learning to care with precision and with patience. They are, in their own small way, doing the work that Arceus built the world to require. This is also the work that does not end. Every trainer who has completed the Pokemon League, who has filled their Pokedex, who has accumulated every ribbon and every trophy the competitive system makes available, finds that the world continues to offer more Pokemon to meet, more relationships to build, more dimensions of the same encounter that the journey is always at its core about. The question, what kind of trainer do you want to be, is never finally answered. It is answered again every day, in every small decision about how to treat the creatures you are responsible for. The professors who give the starters, Those generous and somewhat distracted figures who are always so busy with their research that they need children to do their field work are participating in this project too. They are perpetuating the system that makes trainers possible. They are ensuring that the next generation of young people has the opportunity to learn what their predecessors learned through the same slow and particular process of one person and one Pokemon finding their way together through a world that rewards attention and care. Their research is important, but it is secondary to the relationships that research makes possible. The Pokemon world works, ultimately, because it was built around a truth that turns out to be generative. The truth that connection is the source of strength. That a being who is genuinely known, genuinely cared for, genuinely in relationship with another being who reciprocates that care, can do things that no amount of solitary power could produce. This is not a sentimental idea. It is not a consolation offered to those who lack the raw power to compete on sheer force alone. It is the deep architecture of the world, the way the most powerful things in it operate. The legendary Pokemon maintain the balance not through isolated dominance, but through a network of complementary relationships, each one holding a piece of what the whole requires. The guardian deities of Alola maintain their islands not through unilateral power, but through a relationship with the human communities they protect, a relationship that requires both sides to play their part. Even Arceus, the creator, is described in the mythology not as a solitary absolute, but as the source of a distribution of power that requires many different beings to cooperate in order to work. The trainer and the Pokemon who walk together through the tall grass, who sit together by the fire at the edge of a root, who face the gym leader's best Pokemon in the moment when everything they have built together will be tested, are not small. They are a living expression of the world's deepest principle. Two beings, different from each other in nature and in form, who have found a way to be genuinely present to each other, who have built something between them that belongs to neither alone, who are, in the truest sense the world knows, partners. This is how the Pokemon world actually works, not in the mechanics of the type system, as elegant and consistent as those are, not in the regional geography, as beautifully realized as each new landscape is, not in the legendary hierarchies or the mythological creation events or the political structure of the League and its associated institutions. It works because at every level, from the cosmic balance maintained by Dialga and Palkia to the quiet satisfaction of a well-fed Eevee curled in its trainer's lap, the world is designed around the generative power of genuine relationship. Around the idea that two beings who care about each other, who are present to each other, who grow together through the long shared experience of a journey, become something more than either of them was at the start. That principle is the world's center of gravity. Everything else orbits around it. The question of how Pokemon navigate and map the world around them is one that receives less attention than it deserves. A Pokemon that has lived in a single territory for its entire life carries within it a detailed internal model of that territory. Not a map in the human sense, not an abstracted representation of space, but a lived, embodied knowledge of every path and every source of water and every place where shelter can be found. A ferret patrolling the edges of its established territory is moving through space it knows, in the way that a musician knows a piece of music they have played 1,000 times. The knowledge is in the body. It responds to the environment before conscious attention has engaged. The ferret does not decide to turn left at a certain boulder. It turns left at that boulder because its whole nervous system is already oriented toward what lies beyond it. This embodied territorial knowledge is one of the reasons that wild Pokemon behavior is so difficult to predict without extended observation. The quick summary of a Pokédex entry covers the general parameters. It tells you what a species eats, where it typically lives, how it typically behaves when threatened, but it cannot convey the specific knowledge of a specific individual within a specific territory. The Pokemon that attacks a trainer crossing a patch of tall grass is not simply responding to a generic threat. It is responding to an intrusion into a space it knows intimately, a space whose particular features and resources it has organized its daily life around. The Pokemon Ranger system, with its emphasis on observing and temporarily calming rather than capturing, develops a different relationship to this territorial knowledge than trainer culture does. Rangers learn to read the signs of Pokemon presence and territory without necessarily disrupting it. They learn to move through wild spaces in ways that minimize the friction of their presence. This requires a kind of attentiveness to the landscape itself, a sensitivity to the signals that wild Pokemon leave in their environment that goes beyond what competitive battling typically demands. The ranger who can walk through a Luxray's territory without triggering a confrontation has developed something genuinely different from what a gym challenger develops through the official circuit. Not better, necessarily. Different. A different mode of relationship with the Pokemon world and what it contains. The Pokemon contest spectaculars of Hoenn deepened into the contest hall traditions of Sinnoh in ways that are worth examining more closely. In Sinnoh, contests reached their fullest elaboration as a parallel system to the gym circuit, complete with its own hierarchy of ribbons, its own regional champion figure in Fantina and the contest masters, and its own complex aesthetic theory about what made a performance excellent. The combination of move quality, appeal generation, and the subtle disruption of competitors' performances created a form of competition that was simultaneously aesthetic and strategic. It rewarded trainers who had developed both a genuine creative vision for their Pokemon's performance and the tactical intelligence to execute that vision under competitive pressure. The most interesting thing about contests, viewed from the angle of understanding the world, is how they insist on the expressive dimension of Pokemon. A contest forces a trainer to ask what is beautiful about my Pokemon. What is clever about it? What about it moves an audience? These are not questions that the battle system asks. The battle system asks what is effective, what wins, what beats the opponent. These are not bad questions. They produce genuine expertise and genuine growth. But they are not the only questions worth asking about a creature that has an inner life, that has particular qualities of presence and expression, that is something more than a collection of stats and move effects. The trainer who brings a melodic to a contest and the trainer who brings the same melodic to a ranked battle have, in a sense, different melodic. Not because the Pokemon is different, because the lens through which the trainer sees it is different. The contest trainer sees the way melodic moves in the light, the particular quality of the ripples it produces in the water when it demonstrates its signature move, the way an audience goes quiet when it enters the performance stage. The battle trainer sees the bulk, the natural cure ability, the coverage options, the specific scenarios where melodic's defensive presence creates space for a team. Both of these are real things about melodic. Both of these are legitimate ways of understanding what this creature is. The world is richer for containing both frameworks. The Sinnoh Underground, that vast network of passages beneath the surface of the region, is one of the most quietly extraordinary features of any region in the Pokemon world. It exists below a landscape already defined by ancient mythology and geological significance. The roots of Sinnoh above ground connect towns and gyms and landmarks in the familiar pattern of a trainer's journey. But below, the underground connects a different kind of wealth. Fossils, rare stones, the remnants of a geological history that predates the current surface arrangement of the region by hundreds of millions of years. The spheres used to decorate underground bases, the whole subterranean culture of diggers and collectors and explorers who move through those passages, pursuing resources that the surface world does not offer. The fossils found in the underground are particularly significant. Every fossil is a potential Pokémon preserved against the possibility of restoration. The Cranidos skulls and shield and armor that can be extracted from the rock of the underground are the remains of Pokémon that lived in Sinnoh before human civilization existed there, before the Lake Trio were awakened, before anyone had ever asked what a Pokédex entry should say. They lived and died in a world that was, in its essentials, structured by the same forces that structure it now, the same balance between land and sky and water, the same relationship between predator and prey, between individual and community, between territory and range. The same fundamental question of how to thrive in a world that is always more complex than any single creature's model of it. When those ancient Pokemon are restored, they bring something of that older world with them. Their instincts were shaped by conditions that no longer exist. Their bodies carry adaptations to environments that have been transformed beyond recognition. And yet they live, and they learn, and they adapt, and they develop relationships with the trainers who restore them that are as genuine as any relationship in the contemporary world. This is one of the more remarkable things about Pokemon as a category of being. Their capacity for relationship seems to be robust in a way that transcends the specific conditions that shaped any particular individual. An ancient Pokemon and a modern trainer can find each other across a gap of hundreds of millions of years and build something real. The evolution of the Pokeball technology, from its earliest iterations to the sophisticated array of specialty balls available in contemporary times, tells its own story about the world's developing understanding of the human-Pokemon relationship. The earliest Pokeballs, those simple clay spheres used in the Hisui region, were crude instruments compared to what later generations would develop. They required more preparation. They worked less reliably. The apricorns from which they were made had to be selected carefully and prepared with skill. The whole process of making and using an early Pokeball was more effortful, more personal, and in some ways more honest about what was being attempted. You were not simply throwing a standardized capsule at a wild Pokemon and hoping the catch rate mathematics worked out in your favor. You were using something you or someone you knew had made with their hands, from materials gathered with knowledge of what worked and what did not. The transition to mass-produced Pokeballs, enabled by Silpha's manufacturing capacity and later by Devon's innovations, made the technology universally accessible in a way that transformed trainer culture. When anyone can buy a Pokeball for a trivial sum at any Pokemart, the constraint on partnership becomes not access to the technology, but the skill and care of the trainer. This democratization of the capture technology is, in many ways, one of the most significant events in the social history of the Pokemon world. It is what made the trainer's journey as we know it possible for ordinary young people without special resources or connections. It is what allowed the Pokemon League to develop as a meritocratic institution rather than one accessible only to the wealthy. But the mass production also created a certain casualness about capture that the earlier artisanal tradition did not permit. When a Pokeball costs almost nothing, the psychological friction of throwing one at a wild Pokemon is almost nothing. The careful consideration of whether this is the right Pokemon for this trainer, whether this relationship is likely to be good for both of them, whether this capture is something the Pokemon would choose if it could choose more freely, becomes easier to skip. The specialty balls represent a partial return to the earlier tradition of thoughtfulness. A quick ball, used at the very beginning of a battle, before any relationship has been established, is a different act from a luxury ball used on a Pokemon that has been battled with and respected, and that is being invited in to what its trainer hopes will be a particularly good partnership. The Pokemon world's relationship with its own history is enacted differently in different regions. Kanto, as the original region, carries the weight of being foundational. The structures of trainer culture that every subsequent region builds on or modifies were first established in Kanto. The gym system, the Elite Four, the concept of the champion, the Pokemon League as the formal apex of competitive battling, the Professor Network, the starter Pokemon tradition. These all come from Kanto in the canonical timeline. When later regions revise or reinvent these structures, they are always doing so in implicit conversation with the Kanto model. Alola's trial system is a deliberate alternative to the gym model, organized around the specific spiritual and ecological realities of the island chain rather than the continental model that gyms presuppose. Galar's stadium based gym system is an amplification of the competitive spectacle dimension of the Kanto model, pushed to its logical extreme in a culture where the league has become entertainment as much as test. The Pokemon World Tournament, first explicitly conceived in the Black and White 2 games, represents the logical endpoint of this inter-regional conversation. It imagines a formal institution in which the gym leaders and champions of all regions can be brought into direct comparison. This would require either travel between regions on a significant scale or some kind of formalized international relationship between the league organizations. The World Tournament treats this as possible and even routine. It suggests a world that has, at its most developed, established a kind of sporting diplomacy through Pokemon battling that connects regions who might otherwise have little formal interaction. The relationship between Pokemon and medicine in the world deserves careful attention. The healing abilities of certain Pokemon, particularly those with aromatherapy or Heal Bell, with the cleansing ripples of a Suicune, with the revitalizing golden wind of a Ho-Oh, represent a category of medical practice that supplements and in some cases surpasses anything that human medicine can achieve. The Pokemon Center, for all its remarkable efficiency, is ultimately a technological institution. It uses machinery developed from the understanding of how Pokemon biology works to restore injured Pokemon to health. But the healing that a Chansey provides through soft-boiled care, the warmth of a Blissey that makes injured Pokemon feel genuinely better rather than simply restored to functional parameters, the particular quality of attention that these Pokemon bring to the work of healing represents something the technology alone cannot replicate. The existence of Nurse Joy and her Chansey assistants as the standard staffing model for Pokemon centers across the regions is not accidental. The healing work is understood within the institutional culture of the Pokemon world's medical system to require both the technical infrastructure of the center's machinery and the particular quality of care that a Chansey brings to every patient. A fully automated Pokemon Center would be faster, it would be more scalable, it would require no staff, but it would be missing something that the patients need, something that cannot be provided by a machine. This is a subtle but important acknowledgement of what healing actually requires in a world where the beings being healed have emotional lives that matter to their recovery. Shaman's Gracidea flowers, those blooms that allow Shaman to transform into its sky form, carry within them a healing property that is as much emotional as physical. The Gracidea is given as a gift of gratitude between people and Pokemon. Its scent is associated with thanksgiving, with the acknowledgement of care received and care given. A world in which flowers bloom specifically in response to gratitude, in which the expression of thankfulness has a tangible biological correlate, is a world that takes gratitude seriously as a real force, not just a social nicety, not just a courtesy, but something that changes the world it moves through. The way time works in the Pokemon world is more complicated than the ordinary passage of days and seasons would suggest. Dialga's management of the flow of time is not a simple matter of keeping a cosmic clock running. Time in the Pokemon world can be disrupted, it can be fragmented. The events of the Sinnoh mythology around Dialga and Palkia's confrontation which the protagonist of Diamond and Pearl intervenes in at the spear pillar, represent a genuine crisis in the temporal and spatial structure of the world. Not merely a powerful battle, a crisis in the ongoing coherence of everything. The fact that this crisis is averted, that the protagonist succeeds in calming the legendary Pokémon and restoring the stability of time and space, suggests that the world's ability to maintain its own coherence is not invulnerable. It can be threatened, it has been threatened, and its recovery has depended more than once on the specific actions of specific individuals at specific critical moments. Celebi, the small traveling entity of the Ilex forest, moves through time in a way that is qualitatively different from anything Dialga does. Dialga is the embodiment of time as a structural force, the ongoing guarantee that the past remains the past and the future remains accessible. Celebi moves through time as an individual traveler, appearing in moments that have significance to the forest it is connected to, carrying something of the past and future with it wherever it goes. The time travel that Celebi enables in the mythology around Johto's Ilex forest is not a casual power. It is rooted in the deep temporal significance of the forest itself, a place that has been important enough across enough years that the boundaries between its different eras have become permeable. The time capsule features of the earlier games, the ability to trade Pokemon backward from newer games to older ones within certain generation boundaries, played out in a way that mirrored this temporal permeability. Pokemon could cross the boundary between their present and a past that they had not technically experienced. They carried something of their current identity into an earlier context. They did not simply become what they would have been in the earlier game. They brought what they were from the later context with them. Time, in the Pokemon world, does not simply divide before from after with an uncrossable line. The mystery of how Pokemon communicate with each other has occupied trainers and researchers for generations. The most obvious channel is vocalization. Every Pokemon produces a characteristic sound, a cry that serves as its primary acoustic signature. These cries vary enormously in complexity. Some, like Chateau's, are explicitly capable of mimicking other sounds, learning and reproducing what they hear from their environment. Others, like Meloetta's, carry emotional content that can affect the psychological state of those who hear them. The lullabies of Jigglypuff are only the most famous example of a broader phenomenon. Sound is a mode of Pokemon communication that operates not just informationally, but effectively, not just conveying content, but producing states. Beyond vocalization, many Pokemon communicate through means that are invisible or inaudible to human senses. The chemical signals that grass-type Pokemon exchange through the underground root networks of forests they inhabit represent a form of community communication that requires a completely different sensing apparatus to perceive. The electromagnetic fields generated by electric-type Pokemon carry information about their emotional states and their intentions that other electric types can read with precision. The aura that Riolu and Lucario can sense is one of the most developed examples of this extrasensory communication mode, a form of perceptual access to the emotional and intentional states of nearby beings that goes far beyond what any ordinary sensory system could provide. The significance of this for the human-Pokemon relationship is considerable. Humans experience Pokemon primarily through the channels available to human senses. They see and hear, and through long association, develop a growing ability to read the behavioral cues that a specific Pokemon uses to express its states. But the full range of what a Pokemon is communicating at any given moment, the chemical signals and the electromagnetic fields and the aura-level expressions of inner life, is largely inaccessible to ordinary human perception. This means that the relationship between a trainer and their Pokemon always involves a degree of translation. The trainer's understanding of their Pokemon is always partial, always filtered through the limits of what human senses can receive. The Pokemon's experience of its trainer is presumably more complete. Pokemon live in a richer sensory world than humans do, and they likely know more about what their trainers are feeling and intending than the trainers themselves realize. The Indigo Plateau, where the Elite Four of Kanto and Johto hold their combined championships, is a physical statement about the relationship between competition and mastery. Its location, at the northern extreme of the route network, accessible only after collecting all 8 badges, makes the journey to it a form of proof. Not simply proof of strength, proof of sustained engagement with the world, proof that you have been everywhere the region has to offer, that you have faced what each part of it presents, that you have developed a relationship with the full diversity of the place, rather than simply grinding through the path of least resistance. The gym leaders are, in this sense, not obstacles. They are teachers. Each one is the most accomplished practitioner of a particular tradition within the region. Facing them is not simply competing for a badge. It is an encounter with mastery in one of its forms. It is an invitation to understand something about the world by engaging with someone who understands it deeply. The champion, waiting at the end of this process, is not simply the strongest trainer. In most regions, the champion has been selected or has risen to the position through a combination of competitive excellence and personal qualities that the institution values beyond sheer win rate. Lance's dragon mastery in Kanto and Johto reflects a relationship with the most powerful and traditionally revered type in the regional mythology. Cynthia's deep knowledge of Sinnoh's history and mythology, combined with her exceptional team, makes her something like a living synthesis of everything the region values. Stephen Stone's geology expertise and fossil research connects his championship to a literal deep-time understanding of Hoenn's landscape. These champions are not simply strong. They are expressions of the values their regions hold highest. The wild area of Galar and the open-world landscapes of Paldea represent a significant evolution in how the world is presented to trainers. Earlier generations organized the landscape as a network of roads connecting specific destinations. The routes were spaces you pass through on the way to somewhere else. The wild encounters in them were interruptions of travel rather than the point of it. The wild area changed this by creating a landscape that existed primarily to be explored in itself, without a specific destination that its exploration was instrumental to. And Paldea extended this further, removing the linear progression that even the wild area retained, and presenting a landscape where the trainer's path through it was genuinely self-determined. This shift is not just mechanical, it represents a different theory about what the trainer's journey is for. In the earlier model, the journey was structured by the gym circuit. You moved toward the next gym, and the routes and wild areas between gyms were the substance of the journey. In the later model, the landscape itself is the substance. The gyms and other objectives are points within an open field of experience rather than stages in a predetermined sequence. The trainer's journey in Paldea is, in some ways, closer to what a journey through a real landscape would be. Less scripted, more responsive to curiosity and personal interest, more genuinely exploratory. The Pokémon encountered in these open landscapes are also presented differently. In Galar's wild area and in Paldea, wild Pokémon are visible in the field before any battle begins. They can be observed going about their lives before a trainer decides to interact with them. This visibility makes the ecological reality of wild Pokémon communities more apparent. You can see a group of Wooloo grazing on a hillside before you walk into the middle of them. You can see a Gyarados surfacing in a lake and choose whether to approach it or give it space. The act of noticing a Pokémon and deciding what to do about it becomes more deliberate, more considered, more like something you are choosing rather than something that happens to you. The regional variants that became a consistent feature of the series from Sun and Moon onward represent one of the most ecologically coherent ideas in Pokemon biology. The idea that a species will develop different characteristics in different environments is one of the most basic principles of evolutionary biology, adapted here into a context where the time scales and the mechanisms may differ, but the logic remains intact. An executor in Kanto has not experienced the sustained intensity of tropical sunlight that an Alolan executor has. It has not grown up in an environment where the extraordinary length of its neck was useful rather than cumbersome. The Cantonian form is the result of different environmental pressures, and those differences are visible in what the Pokemon has become.
The Paldean forms continued this trend, with Pokemon like the Paldean Tauros carrying within their differences from other regional Tauros a record of the specific pressures of the Paldean environment. A region with the historical tensions and the geographical variety that Paldea displays would naturally produce Pokemon that have adapted to those specific conditions. The presence of the three different Paldean Tauros forms, each specialized for a different elemental environment, reflects a landscape diverse enough to have produced meaningfully different selective pressures across its different zones. The Galarian forms go even further in expressing how cultural and historical factors, not just ecological ones, can shape Pokemon development. The Galarian Ponyta, with its psychic nature and its pastel coloration, reflects a forest environment that has been steeped in the magical traditions of the region's mythology. The Galarian Farfetch'd, which has developed into a determined and ferocious warrior rather than the naive creature of other regions, reflects an environment where fighting for survival against harder conditions has produced a harder, more focused character. The environment that shapes a Pokemon is not only the physical landscape, it is the whole context of relationships and pressures and cultural meanings that landscape contains. The bond phenomenon, the mega evolution experience in Kalos and Hoenn, is perhaps the most dramatic expression of what the human-Pokemon relationship can achieve when it reaches its deepest expression. Mega evolution requires a keystone, a megastone, and a bond between trainer and Pokemon sufficient to activate the transformation. The bond is not a metaphor here, it is a literal component of the process. A Charizard who mega evolves with a trainer who has not built a genuine relationship with it will not produce the same result as one who has. The transformation reflects and requires the quality of the connection, and what it produces is something that neither trainer nor Pokemon could have anticipated from either side of the relationship alone. A Mega Evolved Pokemon is not simply a more powerful version of what it was. It is a new expression, temporary but real, of what the combination of the Pokemon's nature and the trainer's devotion can produce together.
The design of the Mega Evolutions reflects the specific histories and personalities of the Pokemon involved. Mega Charizard X, the dragon type form, expresses something fierce and focused. Mega Charizard Y is raw power channeled into solar intensity. These are not arbitrary enhancements, they are expressions of specific qualities within Charizard's character, drawn out and amplified by the depth of the bond. The choice between the two Megastones available for Charizard is, in this sense, a choice about which dimension of your relationship with your specific Charizard you want to express. Which aspect of its particular character does the bond between you most strongly illuminate? The fact that Mega Evolution was not available from the beginning of the trainer's journey in Kalos, that it was discovered and developed gradually by trainers who had built the relationships that made it possible, suggests that the world had always contained this potential, but that it required a certain level of human Pokemon connection before it could manifest. The power was always there in the Megastones, but the key to unlocking it was the Keystone and the bond it required. The world was waiting for the relationships to catch up to the possibility. The G-Max Pokemon of Galar present a different version of the same fundamental insight. Dynamaxing, the ability to grow to enormous size and access G-Max moves, is connected to the Galar region's specific history with Eternatus and the energy it has been emitting into the landscape for centuries. The wishing stars that fall from the sky, the Dynamax energy that suffuses the wild area, and certain other locations, the patterns of rings in the earth that mark where Dynamax battles have taken place, All of this is the afterglow of a cosmic event that happened long before any living Galar resident was born. Trainers and Pokemon in Galar benefit from an energy resource that they did not create and do not fully understand, that has been woven into the fabric of their landscape and their cultural practices without anyone making a conscious decision to incorporate it. This is itself a fascinating commentary on how relationships between humans and powerful natural forces develop over time. The earliest inhabitants of Galar who noticed that certain locations allowed Pokemon to grow enormous were not implementing a technology. They were observing a phenomenon and gradually, generation by generation, developing practices around it. The Wishing Star ceremonies, the Max Raid battles, the gym system built around Dynamax activation, all of these are cultural elaborations of an original encounter with a force that the people of Galar did not ask for and cannot fully explain. They have made it their own. They have built an entire dimension of their cultural identity around it, but its origins lie outside of them, in the ancient cosmic event whose trace they live within. The Galar region's enthusiastic culture around competitive Pokemon battling, the enormous stadiums, the celebrity champions, the fan clubs, and the merchandise, and the broadcasting infrastructure reflects something important about how cultural values can shape the human Pokemon relationship. In a culture where competitive battling is the primary lens through which the human Pokemon relationship is publicly understood, the relationship that trainers develop with their Pokemon is influenced by that cultural framing. A young trainer growing up in Galar is surrounded by images of strength and victory as the defining measure of what a trainer Pokemon partnership should produce. The bond is real, and many Galarian trainers develop genuine and deep relationships with their Pokemon. But the cultural emphasis on spectacle and competition creates pressures that other regional cultures handle differently. Leon's character, the undefeated champion who has perhaps the strongest public bond with his Charizard of any trainer in the series, represents the ideal case in which competitive excellence and genuine relationship coexist without either compromising the other. He is not simply a powerful trainer. He is, by all available evidence, someone who genuinely loves his Pokemon and has developed relationships with them that go beyond what the stadiums can capture. His confusion about directions, that running gag that follows him through the story, is a humanizing detail. The most powerful trainer in the region is also someone who cannot reliably find his way from one town to the next without getting lost. He is recognizably a person, not just a performance of competence. The comparison between Leon and Bede, one of the rivals in the Sword and Shield story, illuminates something about how the world's different theories of the trainer's role play out in individual development. Bede enters the story as someone who is pursuing the gym circuit primarily because he believes Chairman Rose wants him to succeed at it. His battling skill is genuine. His relationship with his Pokemon is real, despite his initially cold manner. But the purpose driving his participation in the circuit is external. He is doing it because someone important has told him to, not because the circuit itself is meaningful to him. When Beta discovers his gift for fairy-type Pokemon and is taken under Opal's wing as a potential future gym leader, the shift in his character is palpable. He has found something that is genuinely his, a path that makes sense in terms of his actual nature and his actual relationship with the Pokemon he cares about. This is another expression of the same truth the world keeps returning to. The trainer's journey, at its best, is not about the external markers, not the badges, and not the championship. Those are valid goals, worth pursuing, capable of producing genuine growth. But they work best when they are in service of something more personal, when they are the structure through which a trainer discovers what they actually are and what they actually care about. Bede's eventual role as a gym leader offering his own distinctive challenge to the next generation of trainers who come through is a more fully realized version of what the badge collecting circuit was always supposed to produce. Not a champion, a person who knows themselves well enough to offer genuine opposition to others. The traditions maintained by the older gym leaders across the series deserve more attention than they typically receive. Brock, the rock type specialist of Pewter City, is among the most recognizable figures in all of Pokemon. His initial role as the first gym leader in Kanto establishes him as a foundation. He is where the challenge begins. He is also, when you look at him carefully, one of the more interesting characters in the regional structure. He is the eldest sibling of a large family, effectively its head in the absence of absent parents. His decision to pursue Pokemon training represents a choice made in complicated circumstances, a choice to prioritize his own growth alongside his obligation to his family. His eventual evolution toward wanting to be a Pokemon doctor reflects a trajectory that the gym leader role set in motion but did not itself determine. Misty, the water type specialist of Cerulean City, presents a different kind of complication. Her sisters run the gym as a performance venue as much as a competitive facility. Misty's approach to the gym leadership is more serious than her sister's theatrical style, more invested in genuine competitive quality. The tension between the gym as spectacle and the gym as genuine test is one that runs through the whole Galar system, but that Cerulean City has been navigating in its own quieter way for much longer. Misty's seriousness about water type battle, combined with the performance context she has grown up in, makes her one of the more nuanced gym leaders in the original roster. She knows what the work is. She is doing it within a framework that does not always take it as seriously as she does. The way the Pokemon world handles the question of aging and change within the human Pokemon relationship is one of its most touching ongoing concerns. Pokemon do not appear to age in the same way that humans do, or at least the games rarely dramatize that process directly. But the Pokemon who have been with long term trainers carry the history of that partnership in ways that are visible to those who pay attention. A Pokemon who has traveled with its trainer through years of adventure and growth has become something different from a freshly caught wild Pokemon of the same species, not different in type or in category, different as an individual, different in the specific ways its personality has developed through the specific experiences it has shared with its specific trainer. The tradition in the games of allowing players to transfer Pokemon from older games into newer ones, carrying forward the companions of previous journeys into new contexts, is an implicit acknowledgement of this individual history. The Mewtwo that a player caught in Fire Red and transferred through every subsequent generation carries with it a relationship that spans, in some cases, 2 decades of real time. The player who still has that Mewtwo is not just playing with a powerful Pokemon. They are in a relationship with a specific individual who has been their companion through an extraordinary amount of life. The meaningfulness of that is not trivial. The world built a mechanism to preserve it because the world understands that these relationships are worth preserving. The final examination of how the Pokemon world actually works must return to where it began, because the beginning contains the end, everything that the world has become, all the regions and their gyms and their mythologies and their legendary Pokemon and their cultural traditions and their ecological systems and their competing theories of what the human Pokemon relationship should be. All of it traces back to the moment when a single egg in absolute formlessness began to hatch, to the emergence of a being whose first act was creation, whose creativity did not result in a world of perfect simplicity, of single power expressed without complexity or conflict, but in a world of distribution, of many different forces held in ongoing negotiation, of a structure designed not to prevent all conflict, but to ensure that conflict remains generative rather than catastrophic. The world works because it was designed to work through relationship rather than through dominance. The legendary Pokémon who maintain the weather and the temporal flow and the spatial integrity of the world are not rulers. They are participants in a system that requires all of them. The trainers who carry Pokeballs through tall grass and face gym leaders and eventually stand before the champion are not masters of the Pokemon they travel with. They are partners in something that the Pokemon make possible as much as the trainers do. The professors and their research, the Pokemon centers and their healing, the contests and their aesthetic celebration, the safari zones and their protected wildness, all of these are expressions of a world that has organized itself around the insight that connection is real and that its reality matters. The Pokemon world's treatment of identity across evolutionary lines is one of the more philosophically rich threads running through the entire series. When a Caterpie becomes a Metapod and then a Butterfree, is it the same Pokemon? The question sounds like a riddle, but the world takes it seriously. The games consistently treat evolved Pokemon as the same individual. The friendship built with a Caterpie carries into Metapod and then into Butterfree without loss. The bond does not reset at the evolutionary threshold. Whatever transformation happens within the chrysalis, or the cocoon, or the burst of light that marks a Pokemon's growth into a new form, the individual remains continuous. Something persists through the transformation that is understood by both trainer and world to be the same being. This is philosophically significant because evolution in the Pokemon world is not simply biological development, the gradual maturation of an organism into its adult form. It is a transformation that can be dramatic, that can fundamentally change the physical form, the capabilities, the appearance, even the type alignment of the Pokemon undergoing it. A Magikarp and a Gyarados share a name, a trainer, and a continuous identity, but almost nothing else visible to the outside observer. The Gyarados that emerges from a Magikarp's evolution is not what anyone looking at the Magikarp would have predicted. It is larger, fiercer, more powerful, more terrifying than anything in the Magikarp's nature seems to promise. And yet the trainer who has carried that Magikarp through long stretches of patient training, past the jokes and the dismissals of other trainers who questioned the investment, recognizes something in the Gyarados that is continuous with what they knew before, something that remains, through all the transformation, the particular individual they chose to believe in. The philosophical tradition that resonates here is not the ship of Theseus, not the question of whether an object remains itself when all its parts are replaced. It is something more intimate. It is the question of what in a person, in a being, remains continuous through radical change. The Pokemon world's answer is consistent across every evolution in every game. What persists is the relationship. What persists is the particular bond between this being and the beings who know it. The transformation can change everything material and still leave the essential thing untouched because the essential thing was never material in the first place. The experience of training Phoebus into a melodic is one of the most deliberately humbling storylines in Pokemon's design language. Phoebus is described as ugly, not merely ordinary looking, actually repellent to the eye. Its Pokedex entries across multiple games emphasize its ungainly appearance, its unwelcoming habitat, its apparent undesirability as a companion. And yet within it is the potential to become melodic, which is described as one of the most beautiful Pokemon in existence, a creature that seems to radiate serenity and grace. The mechanism by which this transformation happens makes the statement explicit. The condition required is high beauty contest stats, or in later games, high affection through Pokemon Amy and leveling up. The transformation requires that someone find Phoebus beautiful, or at least care for it with the same quality of attention that other trainers give to more immediately attractive Pokemon. This is not a subtle metaphor. The world is saying directly that beauty is something that is produced by care and attention as much as it is an inherent property of an object. A Phoebus that has been attended to with genuine affection, that has been seen as more than its surface suggests, has something develop within it that was always latent, but that required the right kind of relationship to become fully realized. The melodic is not hidden inside the Phoebus, waiting to get out. The melodic is what Phoebus becomes when it is treated as if it were already worth caring about. This principle extends throughout the world's treatment of Pokemon development. The most powerful Pokemon are not simply those with the highest base stats. They are those whose potential has been most fully realized through the combination of their own nature and the quality of the relationship that has shaped their development. A Magikarp who has been carried through hundreds of battles by a trainer who refused to give up on it becomes a Gyarados who carries something of that refusal within it. A Phoebus who has been tended and appreciated becomes a Melodic who carries something of that appreciation in every movement. The bond is not just emotional, it is developmental. It shapes what the Pokemon actually becomes. The Pokemon world's handling of gender is worth examining with some care because it reveals some of the more unusual aspects of how biology works in this particular world. Pokemon biology includes gender in most species, but handles it in ways that are quite different from real world biological gender. The gender ratios of different species, the fact that some species like Chansey are almost entirely female and others like Hitmonlee are entirely male, reflect ecological realities about those species that the Pokedex entries occasionally illuminate. Chansey's overwhelmingly female ratio is connected to its role as a nurturer and healer. The care that Chansey provides is so central to its ecological role that the female form has dominated the species' development. Hitmonlee's all-male population reflects a different kind of specialization, one where the competitive and martial qualities the species developed were, in the ecology of the Pokemon world, associated more strongly with a particular developmental pathway. The existence of gender differences in some Pokemon's appearance, the male Wobbuffet's distinct feature compared to the female, the different wing patterns of male and female Beautifly and Dustox, the dramatically different appearances of male and female Frillish, these represent a level of biological detail that says something about the world's investment in naturalistic ecological design. These are not arbitrary differences. They reflect an attempt to include the kind of biological variation that real-world species exhibit, adapted to the particular context of Pokemon biology. The world takes seriously the idea that the two individuals of the same species who look different are both legitimate expressions of what that species is. The Pokemon that have no gender, the many species that reproduce asexually or through processes that do not involve sexual reproduction at all, represent another dimension of biological variety. Starmie, Voltorb, Porygon, the various legendary and mythical Pokemon who exist as singular entities without genders. All of these demonstrate that the world's biology is broad enough to include forms of existence that differ fundamentally from the most common biological templates. This breadth is one of the reasons the world feels ecologically real despite its fantastical elements. It is not trying to make everything fit a single biological template. It is acknowledging the genuine diversity of what living systems can look like. The question of what happens to trainers who stop their journeys partway through, who collect some badges but never reach the league, who bond with a team of Pokémon and then return to ordinary life without completing the formal circuit, is one the games rarely address, but that the world clearly contains. Not every trainer becomes a champion. Not every trainer even attempts the full gym circuit. The world is full of people with Pokemon companions who are not trainers in the competitive sense, who maintain their Pokémon as partners in other kinds of work and other kinds of life. The fishermen who populate coastal routes with their Magikarps and Gyarados. The sailors who navigate with the help of water-type companions. The farmers who work alongside Pokémon, whose abilities complement agricultural labor. The artists and musicians who develop creative partnerships with Pokémon, whose own expressive capacities enhance what the human partner is trying to create. The scientists who work alongside Pokémon, whose perceptual or analytical abilities extend what human research alone could not access. These everyday partnerships are the majority of human Pokémon relationships in the world, even if they rarely appear in the foreground of the game's stories. The trainer's journey is the most dramatic and most formally recognized form of the human Pokémon relationship, but it is not the only one, and in many ways, it is not the most representative. The most representative is the unremarkable daily partnership. The Pokémon who wakes up in the morning alongside the human it has chosen to be with, participates in whatever work the day involves, and rests in the evening in a home that belongs to both of them. These relationships are the majority. The world's social fabric is woven from them, and they are not lesser than the championship journey. They are simply different expressions of the same fundamental truth about what the human Pokémon relationship can be. The healing traditions of various regions around specific legendary Pokémon represent some of the most ancient organized religious practices in the world. The shrines to Entei, Raikou, and Suicune found in Johto. The bell tower and its hope for Ho-Oh's return. The ritual acknowledgments of Lugia in the Whirl Islands. The ceremonies at the Three Lakes of Sinnoh connected to the Lake Trio. The Arceus Shrine at Mikina. The altar traditions associated with Kyogre and Gruden in Hoenn. All of these represent institutional expressions of a relationship between human communities and the powerful beings whose territory overlaps with theirs. They are not simply superstition, they are responses to something real. The people who built these shrines and developed these practices had direct experience of what these Pokémon could do, of the scales of force they represented, of the consequences when that force was disrupted. The shrines also represent a theory of what the appropriate human posture toward extraordinary power should be, not to claim it, not to attempt to harness it for human purposes, but to acknowledge it, to mark the territory of its influence with physical structures that say we know this force is here and we respect its reality. This is a form of ecological wisdom rooted in the understanding that some forces in the world are simply not amenable to human control, and that the attempt to control them is more dangerous than the choice to live in respectful relation with them. The contrast between the shrine traditions and the ambitions of the villainous organizations is stark when you place them side by side. Team Galactic, operating in the region where some of the oldest and most elaborate shrine traditions in the series are found, represents the complete rejection of that tradition in favor of the belief that the right application of technology and strategy can bring divine power under human control. The outcome of that rejection is, in every case, catastrophic, not simply defeat, but the near destruction of the structures that make ordinary life possible, the near dissolution of time and space themselves. The way in which nature reserves and protected areas have expanded across the regions in later games represents a real evolution in the world's relationship to wild Pokémon communities. The National Park of Johto, with its bug-catching contest, was an early expression of the idea that certain wild spaces deserved protection and formal cultivation. The idea that wild Pokémon should be able to live in maintained ecosystems, that their habitats should be actively stewarded rather than simply left to compete with human development, represents a form of ecological awareness that the world takes increasingly seriously as it develops. The preservation of habitats for rare and endangered species including some Pokemon whose populations have declined to the point where formal protections are necessary, is another expression of the world's broader understanding that the relationship between humans and Pokemon includes the relationship between human civilization and the wild landscapes that Pokemon inhabit. The sea mobile, that rusted structure in Hoenn's waters, represents a different kind of relationship between human infrastructure and wild Pokemon habitat. A location that was once an active piece of human industry has been, over the decades since its abandonment, gradually claimed by wild Pokemon as their own. The Pokemon who now inhabit the Seimobile have not simply moved into an available space, they have transformed it. The meanings it carries for them are entirely different from the meanings it carried for the humans who built it. It is now their place, their territory, their home, and the human who encounters it has the experience of seeing something that was made for human purposes become, through the patient work of time and wild Pokemon residents, genuinely something else. This is one of the most quietly hopeful images in the entire world. Not because the abandonment of human industry is in itself a good thing, but because of what the image suggests about the resilience of the natural systems that the Pokemon world contains. Given time and space, the wild reclaims. The balance that the legendary Pokemon maintain at the cosmic scale is also maintained at the local scale by the ordinary processes of wild Pokemon communities adapting to and reshaping the landscapes they inhabit. The world does not depend entirely on extraordinary interventions. It also heals through the ordinary rhythms of wildlife going about its business. And then there is the matter of the ocean. The ocean of the Pokemon world is larger, more various, and more full of mystery than any individual game has the time to fully explore. Hoenn's emphasis on water roots gave it a kind of primary contact with the ocean's reality that other regions have approached from a safer distance. The roots and currents of Hoenn's waters are populated by Pokemon whose ecology reflects the actual complexity of a functioning marine ecosystem. Predators and prey, creatures adapted to the sunlit surface zones, and creatures adapted to the crushing dark of the deep. Pokemon that navigate by magnetism, and Pokemon that communicate through bioluminescent pulses, and Pokemon that have never been seen by a human researcher because they live at depths where human technology cannot yet follow. The dive mechanic, introduced in Hoenn and appearing in various forms in later games, represents the first time the world allowed players to move vertically through the ocean rather than simply across its surface. What lies beneath the surface roots of Hoenn is a different world, different Pokemon, different light, different pressures, and different scales of time and space. The ancient ruins visible through the underwater visibility, the structures that humans built here before the ocean covered them, or that were built by beings the exact nature of whom the games leave carefully ambiguous, suggest a depth of history in the world's underwater dimension that the surface stories have barely scratched. Kyogre moves through these depths in its ancient and oceanic way, aware of the history of every seafloor trench and every underwater ridge, with the same intimate knowledge that any creature carries for the territory it has inhabited since before recorded time. When it stirs, the currents of the entire ocean respond, not just in Hoenn. The effects of Kyogre's agitation would be felt in the waters of every coastal region, in the weather systems that those waters generate, in the migrations of the seagoing Pokemon that follow current patterns, shaped by forces they cannot see, but that they navigate by instinct, developed over countless generations. The ocean is one system. What moves in one part of it moves in all of it eventually. The sleep mechanics of the Pokemon games, the requirement that certain Pokemon or their trainers sleep in order to encounter specific things, the Pokemon that only appear at night or only appear when a player has rested in a specific place, have always carried a quiet thematic resonance that goes beyond game design. Rest matters in the Pokemon world, not just as a recovery mechanic, not just as the means by which Pokemon and trainers restore themselves for the next day's challenges. Rest is presented as a genuine good in itself. The world of Pokemon, for all its adventure and its battles and its legendary confrontations, also contains an enormous amount of stillness. The paths at night, lit only by the bioluminescent Pokemon that emerge in darkness. The camps at the edge of routes where trainers and their companions settle together at the end of a long day. The moments of quiet between challenges when nothing particular is being demanded and the world is simply present in its own presence. The Pokemon you see in the dark are different from the ones you see in the day. They are not lesser. They are the other half of the world's fullness. The Clefairy who dances in the moonlight of Mount Moon, the Ghastly who drifts through Lavender Town's quiet streets, the Hoot Hoot who calls from the branches of the night forest, the Noctowl who patrols the edges of darkness, the Umbreon who runs in the cool of the late evening, its golden rings softly glowing. These are not the dramatic figures of the legendaries. They are the ordinary life of the world as it rests, as it does what it always does when the day part of its business is concluded. They are the world being itself without performance. The trainer who is willing to be awake for these hours, who does not rush through the night roads in order to reach the next town faster, encounters a world that the efficiency-focused traveler misses entirely. The world rewards lingering. It rewards the willingness to be in a place for long enough that the place can show you what it is when it is not being presented to you. The Pokemon who emerge at night know something about patience and about the rewards of waiting. They have been here all along. They were here during the day, too, sleeping through the bright hours, carrying within them the knowledge of a world that runs on a different clock. The trainer who meets them learns something that the badges cannot teach. The Pokemon centers function as more than healing stations. They are the infrastructure of trust that makes the whole trainer journey possible. Consider what it means for every region to maintain this network of care. Every remote mountain town, every coastal fishing village, every desert outpost at the edge of a volcanic route. Each one has its own center, staffed and supplied and operational, regardless of how few trainers pass through in a given season. The economy of this maintenance is never questioned within the world because it is not experienced as a burden. It is experienced as simply part of how the world is structured, part of the commitment the world has made to the trainer's journey and to the Pokemon who undergo it. The nurse joy of the smallest and most remote center brings the same quality of attention to every injured Pokemon brought to her counter as her counterpart in the grandest city. The machine that restores them to health operates with the same precision. The welcome that greets the exhausted trainer who has been on a hard route for 3 days is genuine, not perfunctory. This quality of care, maintained uniformly across an enormous diversity of contexts and conditions, is one of the less celebrated but most significant achievements of the world's institutional design. What it creates, in the trainer who has been traveling long enough to notice it, is a certain kind of baseline safety. The knowledge that whatever difficult stretch lies ahead, whatever gym leader presents a challenge that exceeds the current preparation, whatever weather or terrain or unexpected encounter makes the journey harder than expected, there is always a center within reach, always a place where what was hurt can be healed and what was depleted can be restored. The world is not designed to be easy, but it is designed to be survivable. It is designed to give the trainer, who is willing to keep going, the resources necessary to keep going. The way egg hatching works in the Pokemon world is one of the more quietly remarkable biological phenomena in its ecology. Pokemon eggs are carried by trainers, kept warm through movement and proximity until the development inside reaches a point of readiness. The movement is essential. A Pokemon egg that is simply left in storage will not progress toward hatching the way one that is being carried does. This is not simply a game mechanical quirk. It is a statement about the nature of Pokemon development that carries genuine implications for how the world understands the relationship between Pokemon and movement, between being carried and becoming ready. A Pokemon developing inside its egg is already in relationship, already experiencing the world through the ambient warmth and motion of the body that carries it. The hatchling that emerges from its egg has already had its earliest development shaped by the trainer or the Pokemon that kept it close. The initial impressions of movement and warmth and proximity that constitute the egg's experience of the world before hatching may be the foundation of the early attachment that hatchlings typically form with whoever is present at the moment of emergence. They have been with this presence since before they could know anything directly. The relationship has a prehistory in the warmth of being carried. The oval charm, that item that increases the likelihood of finding Pokemon eggs at the daycare, is a concentration of this principle. It creates conditions more favorable to the formation of eggs, to the beginning of new lives. The fact that it takes the form of a charm rather than a machine, that it operates through something more like enhancement of natural conditions than technical manipulation of biological processes, reflects a consistent pattern in the world's most effective interventions in natural processes. They tend to work with the grain of what is already happening rather than against it. They support and amplify the world's own tendencies toward generation and renewal rather than forcing those tendencies to serve artificial ends. The fairy type, introduced formally in Kalos, represents one of the most significant expansions of the world's understanding of what kinds of elemental force exist in it. Before the formal recognition of the fairy type, many Pokemon were already expressing qualities that the new type category would eventually organize and name. The gentle power of Clefairy dancing in moonlight, the protective warmth of Togekiss, and the joy it brings to peaceful places. The ancient enchantment of Snubbull and Granbull, the whimsy of Sylveon's ribbons, and their emotional attunement. These qualities were present in the world before the theoretical framework existed to name them. The creation of the fairy type was not the invention of these qualities. It was the recognition that they were real and distinct and worth formally acknowledging. The relationship between the fairy type and the dragon type is one of the more philosophically interesting typing dynamics in the system. Dragon types represent raw, ancient power, the kinds of force that have existed in the world since its earliest ages, concentrated into physical forms that carry their own mythology. Fairy types represent something that checks and counters this ancient power with a quality of enchantment and spiritual grace that the raw force of dragons simply cannot overwhelm. The implication is that the world contains forces older and more persistent than raw power, that the gentler, more subtle qualities of the world have a kind of resilience that sheer force cannot simply overcome. This is expressed beautifully in the mythology around Xerneas, the life Pokemon of Kalos. Xerneas's power is to give eternal life, to create the conditions under which living things can persist through time. Its counterparts, Eviltal, takes life, gathering it up at the end of its existence before entering dormancy. Both are necessary. The cycle of life and death that they represent together is more fundamental than either force alone. But the life-giving quality of Xerneas, that fairy-type essence of generation and renewal and the persistence of gentle things, is presented as the quality that ultimately makes the cycle worth having, not simply death and renewal as a mechanical process, but life as something that has genuine worth preserving through the long patience of a Pokemon who has been sleeping in the form of a tree for an age and will sleep again when the time comes. The mythology around the creation of Pokemon types, the plates that Arceus carries and that it distributed to create the type guardians that maintain each elemental force in the world, is one of the most elaborate cosmological systems in all of Pokemon lore. 17 plates, each corresponding to a different type, each containing within it the distilled essence of that type's particular relationship to the world's fundamental forces. The plates are not simply powerful items, though they are certainly that. They are pieces of the original creative act, remnants of the moment when Arceus moved from formlessness toward the differentiated world that everything else was going to inhabit. Each plate carries within it a condensation of one of the 17 ways the world's energy can take form and operate. The 16 Pokémon who serve as type representatives in the world, figures like Groudon for ground, Kyogre for water, Rayquaza for flying, the various legendary birds and beasts and forces that populate the mythologies of every region, are all, in some sense, expressions of the same creative differentiation that the plates represent. They are the ongoing living presence of the types they embody, not simply creatures that happen to be that type, but beings whose entire nature is organized around being the purest expression of what that type is. This gives the legendary Pokemon a cosmological significance that goes beyond their individual power. They are not simply the strongest members of their types. They are the reason those types exist in their current form in the world. A world without Groudon would be a world where the ground type's relationship to the world's geological forces was somehow different, less focused, less purposefully directed. A world without the legendary birds would be a world where the fundamental forces of ice, thunder, and fire express themselves without the focal points that give them their characteristic shapes and intensities. The Pokemon world contains within its mythology a consistent theory of how disaster happens and how recovery follows it. Disaster is never random in the Pokemon world's mythological structure. It is always the result of a specific kind of failure. Either a human or a Pokemon has tried to concentrate power that was meant to be distributed, has tried to make the world serve a singular vision rather than the ongoing negotiation of many, has disrupted one of the balancing mechanisms that the world contains in order to force an outcome that the world's own systems would not have produced. The aftermath of these disasters is also consistent. The world recovers, not immediately, not easily, not without cost. The legendary beasts created from the ashes of the Brass Tower Tower fire are a form of recovery, but they are also a permanent record of the disaster itself. They carry their origins with them through every landscape they cross. The recovery does not erase what caused it, but it does mean that what was destroyed is not simply gone. Something new, shaped by the destruction and by the response to it, continues. This is one of the most psychologically complex things the Pokemon world offers. It does not promise that nothing will go wrong. It does not promise that the disasters, when they come, will be small or limited. The Kalos War that produced AZ's guilt, the 3,000 years of the world carrying someone who had done something terrible for a reason that was pure grief, is not presented as a minor incident that the world moved past quickly. It was enormous. Its consequences reached across 3 millennia. But the world continued. AZ's continued. And eventually, through the events of the Kalos story, even his grief found a form of resolution that had not been available to it before. A small white flower and a reunion that should have been impossible, made possible by the same world that had carried the wound for all those years without closing it prematurely. The routes between towns in the Pokemon world are not neutral corridors. They are the world's most honest places. In a town, the structures of human organization mediate the experience. The Pokemon Center with its reliable healing, the shops with their organized inventory, the gym with its formal challenge, the people in the town who have things to say and positions to take and roles to occupy. The town is the world in its human organized form. The route is the world as it actually is, unmediated by human planning, populated by Pokemon who are following their own logic, their own patterns, their own understanding of the landscape. A trainer on a route is in the world's domain rather than the human domain. They are a visitor in a space that was there before them and will be there after them. This is why the routes are where the most formative experiences of the trainer's journey typically occur, not in the gym battles, which are scheduled and contained and conducted according to rules, but in the routes where an unexpected encounter with a Pokémon you had not planned to meet can change the entire direction of the journey, where the weather turns and the landscape requires something different from what you brought to it, where you are simply a young person with some Pokemon and a limited supply of items, navigating something genuinely larger than you. The tall grass is, in this sense, one of the most symbolically significant features of the world, the place where the boundary between the human domain and the Pokemon domain is thinnest, where the next step might take you into contact with something wild and unexpected, where the journey's next development waits in a form you cannot see until you enter it. The trainer, who has walked through enough tall grass, has learned something about risk and about the rewards of going forward anyway, about the specific kind of courage that does not come from certainty about what lies ahead, but from confidence in your ability to meet it when it arrives. The sound design of the world, those particular melodies and themes that have accompanied every regional journey since the series began, deserves to be understood as part of how the world actually works, rather than simply as a feature of the games that represent it. The music of the Pokemon worlds is its atmosphere made audible. The town themes carry within them the specific quality of each location's identity. The route themes change as the landscape changes, as the terrain becomes more elevated or more coastal or more forested or more arid. The gym themes express the personality of the leader and the tradition they represent. The legendary encounter themes are genuinely overwhelming, carrying the weight of what is about to happen with a musical intensity that the visual presentation alone cannot achieve. Meloetta's role in the world connects the music to the living fabric of things in a way that is more than metaphorical. Music in the Pokemon world has genuine effects on the world around it. Jigglypuff's lullaby puts listeners to sleep in a way that is as reliable as any chemical sedative, but that operates through an entirely different mechanism. The relic song that changes Meloetta's form is a piece of music so old and so embedded in the world's structure that it has retained the power to alter fundamental biological states across the millennia since it was first sung. These are not exceptional cases. They are concentrated examples of a broader truth. The world responds to music. The world has always responded to music. The Pokemon who communicate through song and the humans who play music in the game's towns and cities are all participating in a world where sound is a genuine force. Kenilov Library in Sinnoh holds within its shelves some of the oldest written records in any region. The creation myths in those volumes are not simply stories. They are the accumulated attempt of many generations of scholars to make sense of the world they live in, to understand why it has the form it has, to connect the geological and meteorological and ecological realities of the present to the mythological narratives that the oldest traditions preserved. The scholars who work in these libraries are doing something genuinely important. They are maintaining the connective tissue between the world's present and its past. They are ensuring that the understanding of why things are the way they are does not get lost in the relentless forward motion of living. The ruins of Alf in Johto, with their unowned populations and their ancient inscriptions, represented a different kind of knowledge preservation. The unowned themselves are not simply strange-shaped Pokemon who happen to resemble alphabetic characters. They are, according to the deeper mythology, beings with a relationship to language and meaning that goes further than surface resemblance. The inscriptions in the ruins carry histories that are older than the Johto region in its current form. The researchers who study them are in contact with layers of the world's past that the official history books have not reached. These places of preserved knowledge are not simply historical curiosities, they are resources that the world needs. The understanding that certain scholars and traditions maintain of the connections between the world's ancient mythological structure and its present operation is directly relevant to the recurrent crises that the world faces. It was knowledge of this kind, maintained through traditions that many dismissed as merely academic, that enabled the protagonists of various regional stories to understand what was happening when the legendary forces were disrupted and what needed to be done to restore balance. The libraries and the ruins and the scholarly traditions that inhabit them are, in a functional sense, part of the world's maintenance infrastructure. They preserve the knowledge the world needs to understand and repair itself. The professor who gives the starter is not simply providing a tool for the journey ahead. They are initiating a relationship that the world expects to be the most important one the young trainer will form. The starter is chosen first, before anything else, before the route and the wild encounters and the gym badges and everything the journey will involve. The starter is the relationship that precedes all others and that in some ways shapes how all others are understood. The three starter types, grass, fire, and water, are not arbitrary. They are the three sides of the most fundamental ecological triangle in the world. The three forms of elemental energy that underlie every living system. Grass draws its power from light and growth. Fire draws its power from heat and transformation. Water draws its power from flow and persistence. Together they form a complete system. A world with all three types present is a world with the full range of elemental energies available. The choice between them at the start of the journey is a choice about which of these fundamental energies will be the primary lens through which the trainer begins to understand the world. The starter that grows alongside its trainer, that develops from the relatively small and vulnerable beginning form through its middle stage into the impressive and powerful final evolution, and acts in miniature the arc of the journey itself. Small and uncertain at the start, growing through challenges, becoming something unexpected in its final form. The Charizard that was once a Charmander, uncertain about its first battle. The Blastoise that was once a Squirtle, learning to direct the jets of water it was discovering it could produce. The Venusaur that was once a Bulbasaur, carrying the first faint fragrance of the bud on its back. These transformations are the journey's own arc, compressed into the form of the being who travels it alongside the trainer. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.